we need people who understand how physiology works and how the, inner workings of your body are so important for, just this conversation around optimal health. So if you're overweight, you're obese, most likely either have poor testosterone levels, or even if your testosterone's in the normal range for total T, your free T may not be good, or you're converting a disproportionate amount of that testosterone to estrogen.
The blame comes on the industry, right? That health, fitness, strength industry, to be able to educate and to close that gap.
But if they don't actually start to train and improve the quality of their food, they still have some issues there underneath the surface that need to be tackled, and it's still going to play into their quality of life and their longevity.
All right, guys, we're back with another episode of Table Talk. My guest today is Sam Miller, co-host Tom Shepard. Sam is the author of Metabolism Made Simple, specializes in nutrition and health optimization. And I have scribbled my notes. I don't want to screw up the name of your podcast, but is it Sam Miller? What is it?
It's just Sam Miller and the word science. So
okay, Science. So I got it looks like seminar science, but it's Sam Miller Science.
Correct.
And you got a couple hundred episodes on there, right?
Yeah, there's tons of free content. So I always tell people to check that stuff out. I just started that project because it was a lot of information I wish I had when I started out, and things that were hard to find, or you're going on internet forums or information that's misapplied for particular situations. So tons of episodes on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and then just recently started on YouTube so I can be like you guys as well.
Awesome. How did you get to where you are now? So we'll just use the book as the jumping off place. What was the motivation for the book?
So it's interesting. When I started in the industry, I have a basic training background, went and got certified for that, learned about nutrition, went and got my master's, kind of went more of a somewhat conventional path, but had an injury of my own. So I had a head injury that impacted my endocrine system. So I had a concussion. Kind of the aftermath of that led me down a lot of different rabbit holes. And I always felt like it was very hard to find sources of information in the industry that would translate these complex concepts into things that you could actually leverage for a real goal, whether it was competing in physique or bodybuilding, whether you want to be a strength athlete, whether you're just general mom and pop lifestyle client. Just felt like a lot of the stuff out there was either completely misapplied for certain populations or just not good information at all. So the book was something that came about, started writing that around like 2020, 2021. And it wasn't like I set out to in my career, like, oh, I'm going to write a book. It just happened because I felt there was a need for it. I had created a lot of content over the years. I had gotten into a place where I felt like the writing could be a form of contribution, and also understanding that not every single person either has had a coach or they even know where to start. And then even for people who are teaching within our industry, there's just a lot of shitty information out there. So that's really kind of where the book came from, was just to make sense of nutrition to help people with whether it be their metabolic health, or you have a physique goal. You can even use it, whether it is a strength sport or not. So the book was something that just was the culmination of a lot of other content like the podcast. And I was thinking, hey, I should write these ideas down because I have certain frameworks and ways I like to think about problems. And I felt like the book was the best way to, start with that.
So what is the demographic that you work with now, and what do you do?
So for a long time, like 15 years or so, mainly working with, regular clients, B2C, doing nutrition coaching and fitness coaching and things like that. Now I mainly try to help coaches with more complex cases that they're kind of stuck on, or, teaching nutrition and health optimization to other health professionals. Also, like you were in America Health Hat, we've worked with a lot of their patient care coordinators and health coaches to help them understand how things like nutrition, lifestyle, micronutrients connect with those labs that they're pulling. So rather than looking at it like a Western medicine provider, looking at it from the lens of, okay, how does manipulating my training and nutrition impact my blood chemistry and things like that. So we work with companies like Merrick, for example. They're one of our program partners, but also have worked with plenty of other health professionals who want to do something similar, kind of like what you've experienced there. So being able to understand physiology, blood chemistry, gut health, how does all of that connect, and how is that impacting both your performance and overall physique outcomes as well? So whether you're a competitor or, because I've collaborated with guys like John Jewett on his podcast. So whether you're a competitor, lifestyle or strength athlete, there's still certain aspects of our physiology that we kind of need to work with it instead of against it, or it's going to make your life miserable. So really, I'm helping mostly health and fitness professionals now, but for a long time, I was just, coaching people who needed the help. And that kind of brought me from working in person to then, kind of building online and, writing and doing content contribution and stuff like that.
How big is that disconnect now with what you're talking about because there's more TRT clinics than there's ever been.
Right.
I kind of joke and call some of them like a test club for men.
Basically.
So you just send your driver's license and order Equipoise or whatever it is when it comes in. And then on the other side, there's the ones that are looking at all the other micronutrients and all the other factors that can influence that. That seems, in my experience, being in a bubble and being fortunate enough to have America and Dr. Serrano, to be the minority.
Oh, for sure.
Everything that's going on.
Yeah, Serrano, Merrick, there's only a handful of companies that really even begin to approach that level of specificity. Most places, not only are they not even running enough testing in the first place, so there are some places you'll literally only get like a testosterone value. They may not even check your free, and then maybe they run like a CBC and CMP, which is basically just a complete blood count and basic metabolic panel that you could go get at your primary care physician. It's not a super expensive test. They'll draw that, maybe your testosterone. They may not even look at things like thyroid, estrogen, SHBG. So they're not even pulling these comprehensive tests, and they are by far just like popping up everywhere. So you see them because there's this need for it, and there's a massive monetary opportunity. So people see the business side of it, but they're not actually doing what's necessary from a fulfillment aspect of truly, mastering their craft when it comes to that. So the testing is pretty poor, and even some of the ways that they go about scripting medications, and this is something Ali talks about, is like they'll have these cocktails of like they're blending, testosterone, aromatase inhibitors, and everything together in one, and it's like that's not really a great way to do it. So yeah, I would say those far outnumber the good quality, reputable brands, especially from a telemedicine perspective, for sure.
So you say there, sorry, the testing procedure is not thorough enough. So like, let's say for someone in the audience now who's maybe concerned they might need TRT, they're going to somewhere they think is reputable. What do you think should be on a panel that allows you to make a real informed decision as opposed to just that really basic threadbare approach? What would you like to see so you can make a proper decision on that?
So I think in addition to your baseline health markers, CBC, CMP, we should be looking at, ideally, if this is a perfect world, I also want to see someone's insulin sensitivity, because if you're not metabolically healthy, you are going to have low T for sure. So if you're overweight, you're obese, you're going to most likely either have poor testosterone levels, or even if your testosterone's in the normal range for total T, your free T may not be good, or you're converting a disproportionate amount of that testosterone to estrogen, because in your body fat, you actually have a lot of aromatase in your adipose tissue, which is basically converting that testosterone to estrogen. So I'd love to see that. Thyroid health, because a lot of times hypothyroidism in men will correlate a bit with hypogonadism or low T. I'd also want to see LH and FSH, so the communication between your brain and your testicles, because if we're not seeing that communication, we don't know the root cause for the low T. So a thorough panel should include that. If someone's been low carb dieting for a long period of time, they're going to have very high levels of SHBG, which is that binding protein that binds to your reproductive hormones. So for SHBG, if that's climbing, I've seen people who are high stress, low carb, under eating. They've been in a diet phase for a long time. Think of like a natural male physique competitor bodybuilder, right? Natural bodybuilder, dieting, low energy availability, low calories. They're going to get to a place where that value's climbing. They don't have the micronutrients or macronutrients for that adequate testosterone production. Their sleep probably sucks. Of course, we're going to see that decline in total T, free T, and maybe even have that SHBG climbing along with thyroid going down. So I would love to see your CBC, your CMP, your thyroid values, not just TSH, but also free T3 and free T4, your testosterone and free testosterone, SHBG, fasting insulin, A1C, which is also a marker of insulin sensitivity, and potentially some other health markers. So if you have like a cardiovascular history, looking at lipoprotein A and ApoB. So LPA and ApoB are basically just, think of more specific indicators of your heart health and cardiovascular risk that go beyond the basic lipids and triglycerides that your normal primary care physician is going to pull. Because one of the when we're having this conversation around hormones, we have to understand if you're low T, and especially if you're not aromatizing in estrogen is actually cardioprotective for men and in women when we see them go through perimenopause. I know we have a lot of male listeners, but for any women in the audience, you should also be pulling very similar markers and progesterone as well to see if you're still cycling regularly. And then after that, looking at those markers, ApoB and LPA, are going to give us that good gauge of cardiovascular risk and longevity factors that we should pay attention to. If you're an athlete, take a couple days off training before those labs, and also pull a highly sensitive C-reactive protein, which is a marker for inflammation. So those are going to be great places to start, because then we can go down different rabbit holes depending on what the values spit back. And from that panel, then you can determine how you want to dive in further. Is this something that can be fixed with nutrition and training? Because I've seen people where it's like, okay, you think you need TRT, but you're training 7 days a week. You don't have a rest day. Your sleep sucks. You're high stress, from your job or family, whatever. Maybe you're not eating enough, or what you're eating is not adequate in micronutrients. Our supplements aren't appropriate for what our goals are. And we get into this place where it's like, okay, that can be corrected, especially if you're younger. And then there are folks who do legitimately have lower testosterone, or they don't feel very good, even in kind of the normal range. And that's where having that conversation around both biofeedback and the lab values is going to be really important. So biofeedback just meaning like your quality of life, your energy levels, and things like that.
All right, so if we play this out, kind of how it works in the real world, right? You'll have the people that decide that route, right, to go with somebody that knows how to read all that pulls in the lifestyle and all that. But that's already the minority. Then you're going to have the other group of people, which is probably the majority, that somebody tells them, or they just see some podcast and think, I need to go on testosterone. So then either their primary care, which maybe not, probably more maybe today than ever before, or a test club for men, they go on that. Then they're going to feel better, right? Correct. So that's one path. So they're going to feel better for a while, right? Compared to the other path is going to be able to feel better forever. Right. So it's when we're addressing that path of, I just need test, because it may be that, or they just find the bro in the gym to take the test, then it kind of acts as a Band-Aid per se, right? That will make them feel better for X period of time, but then it will manifest itself in what ways? Lack of progress in the gym. And then what other ways will that manifest? Because those are the people who are probably listening to the majority now.
And if they're not doing it correctly, that test club for men, they may feel worse. So if, let's say they put them on, I've seen guys go on, maybe it's too much of an aromatase inhibitor, or the testosterone is not administered appropriately. I mean, I've seen TRT from the VA that like the administration relative to the half-life of the drug makes no sense, and guys feel like shit. So they'll get 200 milligrams and then it's like, come back in 2 to 4 weeks. It's like, dude, no, you should be doing that like every 2 to 4, or not 200 milligrams, but take your total weekly amount and work with your provider, work with your doctor to figure out the appropriate injection administration frequency for you, which for a lot of people is a few times a week, or a couple times a week, and they may feel best based on the peaks and troughs of that testosterone. So some people go to those test clubs for men and the cookie cutter stuff, and they get these scripts and they feel absolutely terrible, or it impacts their erectile function, or they're put on too high of a dose of AIs, or they may not even need it to begin with.
That was one of the things I was going to say.
Yeah, they may not even need it, and then their lipid profile tanks because they'll lower, it'll disproportionately lower their HDL even further. So that can potentially increase. It's not great from a neurological health or cardiovascular health perspective. So with the cookie cutter option and getting scripted these things you may not need, we see a couple potential fallouts. One is you feel okay, or you feel good because you now have testosterone, which may be masking things like a Band-Aid, like you said, but we've increased your cardiovascular risk and your neurological health may be in jeopardy, depending on how that plays out. Depending on the quality, or if you go with the gym bro or whatever, you may potentially be seeing in your lab certain things like your liver and kidney markers may not be fantastic. That's something I've certainly seen over time. Or, you go that route and maybe it's someone who, because they haven't addressed the root cause, the lifestyle factors, you can give that person more testosterone, but if they don't actually start to train and improve the quality of their food, they still have some issues there underneath the surface that need to be tackled, and it's still going to play into their quality of life and their longevity if we don't get on top of it. So there are like 3 different directions down that test club for men rabbit hole that they don't really go super well for anybody. And then with the more tailored approach, you can either kind of titrate and figure things out. You can also look at individual. The problem I have with, if we're not taking that tailored, individualized approach, you end up relying on too much polypharmacy versus being able to kind of figure out, okay, let's get your lifestyle in check. Let's work on your nutrition and training. If you do in fact need testosterone, you start with the bioidentical testosterone. You kind of figure out your response to that, what your side effects are. And then rather than adding in all these different compounds out of the gate, like, dude, you didn't even know how you were going to respond to testosterone by itself, figure out your administration frequency or the total milligram amount you need in a week. That's already like 3 variables. And now your doctor just automatically scripted you this other stuff. And I've seen this play out. I mean, even originally before he switched, like my barber had this issue. He went to some guy who just marketed himself as like anti-aging, whatever, just get your testosterone here, gets, a vial that has a bunch of different shit compounded into it. Not individualized dosing for him, and then tries to sell him a bunch of different peptides and things on top of that just to increase, because from a business perspective,
in that main bottle there's AI and crap in the main bottle.
Yeah, sometimes I definitely talk to your doctor, but it's not a great idea. As far as different things can be compounded in there, I've seen AIs, I've seen different forms of testosterone and different blends, which as far as for most people, it's like they should figure out how they respond to just a bioidentical testosterone first. If you're younger, there may be a case to be made for using something like HCG as a concurrent administration or therapy to preserve testicular function and fertility. And some people prefer using that, but then other people, let's say you have high body fat levels and you haven't gotten that under control, or you aromatize a lot of testosterone and estrogen, you may actually not feel as great taking something like HCG. So it depends what our goal is. And also, do we have fertility considerations and other things? There's advice right now where it's like, it's targeted for a 47-year-old dude, and a 26-year-old guy is taking that advice and trying to apply it, and realize those are 2 very different people at different stages of life with different goals, different health risks. And what is the time horizon that this person's going to actually be on that medication?
I'm glad you mentioned the kind of titration and like starting out there, because like a lot of the guys I talk to who are on TRT,
it's like super TRT.
Yeah, they're on like 200 or 300 milligrams or something, right? And it's TRT. And I say, like, that's to put a ballpark figure on it. A male who's functioning well, as in metabolizing it properly and functioning properly, should probably be able to get a normal range on 80 to 100 milligrams per week a lot of the time.
Normal range of what?
Well, as in, we'll put them kind of moderate.
Yeah, it may put them in the Western range, but remember, so anytime you're adding that exogenous hormone, and we see this, whether it's whether you're interested in HRT or you listen to Table Talk and you're interested in PEDs or you're an athlete, anytime you're adding exogenous hormones, you suppress your own hormone production. So the risk of going too low is you're hopping on something and you're suppressing your own function, testicular production of testosterone through the administration of basically taking the 80 to 100 of test. Now, if you went to a Western medicine endocrinologist, is it possible, depending on your age and your current lab values, that they may script you 100 a week? It's possible. I'd say most people may be a little north of that. Is 300 a little high? Most people can be in a pretty good range of their free T and total T without needing a script for that, from what I've seen and observed. But I think there's plenty of people who, it's really not a one size fits all answer, because, someone's energy levels, there are people who could take 140 milligrams. And if their administration frequency is spot on, they're lean, their percent conversion of testosterone estradiol is in a good spot, good free T, they don't have any existing thyroid issues or anything like that, they could feel great. And then you could have other people who go on that amount and they need a little bit more. And that's why, to bring the conversation back to these kind of cookie cutter clinics and Test Club for Men, the reason that's such a problem is because there's like a generally accepted range in what you're legally allowed to script if you're a physician, but it's not going to be the same for everybody. Also, what is their history with, if this is someone who maybe was a strength athlete and used a lot of testosterone in the past, what are their needs compared to someone who's maybe younger, and what is like the reason for the low testosterone too? If it's stress, sleep, under eating versus someone who's maybe overweight and obese, those are different situations, So I'd say it's really, really hard to put some parameters on it. I would say 80 sounds low. I have seen 100 scripted before by a physician, and I've also seen north of 200. So it's, that's where it's a little bit tricky.
I guess the point I was trying to make there was just that, how do you, at that point, that was his entry level, was like 300.
Oh,
right?
yeah.
So it's like, how do you know if, like, the point the way I should have worded was, some people can get by on like 80 to 100.
There's something to be said for minimum effective dose, for sure.
How do you know you need 300 at that point if you haven't gone through that titration process, or you haven't looked at those other factors, like how much are you converting to estrogen, what's your insulin sensitivity like, and all that? Maybe you could be feeling great on half the dose or 2/3 the dose, or whatever it might be,
That's a great point. I think really what you're saying there's just like, explore the minimum effective dose for you. It's super true. Now the amount may vary person to person. And I think that conversation applies for a lot of different things, right? It applies for maybe your training stimulus. It applies for, your drug use. It applies for TRT. You got to kind of figure out what your body's responding to. But yeah, some people just overshoot it because they think, because they saw their friend do something that they think they need to do it too.
With the dosing, because you said earlier with the testosterone, the dosing, what I'll see, and personally as well, if it's once a week and then you miss a week, then it's all over the place. Where have you found if it's more frequent that doesn't drop as hard?
Yeah, just think about waves, right? So instead of having very high peaks and troughs, you're basically just making it a little bit more of that even frequency kind of across the board.
But with a 7-day half-life, how's that play out?
So, you don't necessarily need to. So with the half-lives, basically, remember, but if you're injecting a smaller amount, so let's say instead of 100, it was 50, that half-life in, let's say 7 to 10 days or whatever, now you're going to have half of that, a milligram total. I still think there's a quality of life, and while there may be a slight difference in your labs, it's not going to be, the difference in your labs may not be the same as the difference in how you feel. Right. So some people just feel better with more frequent administration. And that's also relative to how you tolerate pinning. Like some people don't enjoy pinning. So it's like, can you go to something that's more tolerable? And, folks will script like insulin syringes instead of larger needles, and that's better for them. Right. So as far as the differences you may see slightly less aromatization. And when you don't have that bolus injection, so when you go very, very high with your androgens, you're going to kind of artificially lower SHBG, or not artificially, but you will have this like transient lowering of sex hormone binding globulin, which is that binding protein we talked about earlier. So simply by adjusting that injection, you can kind of get things to not only stabilize a little bit, but you're not like crashing your SHBG and getting this bolus administration to test and then needing more again. So instead of relying on solely the half-life and how long that stores in your body, you just have a little bit more control over your levels. And because it is that dose, you're able to kind of titrate and adjust. So if someone was taking like X amount 2 times per week, it's like, okay, well, how would they feel if they took their total dose and divided into a third and it was Monday, Wednesday, Friday, right? It's just at that point though, when you've entered that level of the conversation, that's where you really need, you need a good provider, you need someone who kind of knows what they're doing, you need to be getting your stuff from like a, good pharmacy, compounding pharmacy, whatever. And ideally you're getting your labs monitored, because the answer, I could give you a million opinions on this podcast. My opinion does not matter. What matters is your labs and how you feel, right? There's not one perfect answer for everyone. Generally speaking, majority of guys would stand to benefit if instead of 1 time a week or less frequently than that, they would probably stand to benefit from 2 to 3 times, right? Or every other day. But part of that is your lifestyle. And let's say you travel a lot, or you're forgetful, or you need to set your up. What can you be consistent with? It's kind of like, I bring it back to training and nutrition too, because it's like your doctor could go look at your labs and tell you what to do, but if you don't do it, it doesn't matter. You're not actually applying what it is that needs to be done. So there's a level of practicality too. It's like, let's look at what's best for you. Look at your labs, see how you're doing from a quality of life perspective. But again, like, what can you actually execute? Because if you can't, like, it's still you're going to come back to suboptimal area anyway. So that conversation should be happening between you and your doctor. And if it's not, you probably need another doctor.
Yes.
Can we just touch on you've mentioned SHBG there a couple of times. So I just wanted to touch on that, because people are slowly kind of accepting that estrogen isn't the devil that's trying to kill all your gains and so on, right? But I think it's almost like SHBG is now becoming the new devil. Where I've got a lot. I talk to so many guys whose they're on whatever, and their SHBG is a normal range, and they're doing everything they can to bring it down. But it's like one of the most common things, at least I've seen, in what you'd class as like a hypo responder to androgens is super low SHBG. So do you mind kind of just talking about that a bit, how that works and why less is not better in that scenario?
Yeah. So with some things, especially with hormones, it's like finding your Goldilocks amount. So SHBG is not bad, just like, estradiol is not bad. It's all just kind of relative. And people think that just because it's, because it is binding to androgens that, oh my God, like I'm not actually getting any sort of benefit from it. Before you go crazy about anything, just kind of answer some basic questions, because these things will influence your SHBG, your insulin sensitivity, your insulin resistance. Have you been dieting? What does your macronutrient profile look like? Even basic micronutrient status, so including things like boron can help, right? But I think some people will add PEDs sometimes to lower SHBG further. Now, if you have the level of SHBG of like a woman on birth control, which would be very high SHBG, that's certainly not ideal. But I think there is a very large population of people where it's basically they're taking that. You don't want zero SPG. Think of it as like a little carrier or like a raft. Like it's not necessarily a bad thing. Yeah. Just get it, work based on your labs and kind of figure out what's going to be best for you. And usually if you can get your diet and lifestyle in a good place and you're using kind of appropriate administration relative to your situation, you can get that to fall in line, especially if you're not doing these massive boluses or, adding a bunch of other compounds that are kind of keeping that low.
Yeah. I mean, the way I've tried to word it to people, and you can probably correct me here because I'm kind of like altering it to make it easier to understand, but like if you're putting a bolus of androgens into the bloodstream, there's only so much you can actually absorb and utilize at once, right? So if there's no SHBG, there's nothing to take those androgens that are in the bloodstream and temporarily just isolate them. Does that make sense? Whereas like if you have some, then over time, some of it will get released, and then that means it can be of use later on.
And only only a very small percentage of your total testosterone is free testosterone anyways, right? So it's like, we wouldn't even want that. Yeah. You shouldn't be shooting for like a zero SHBG. That's bad. So I would say, I'm pretty sure it's actually, this is like a Serrano stat, and I don't want to butcher it, but Dave, since you're seeing him soon, you should probably ask him this, but I'm pretty sure there's also a relationship between SHBG and mortality, like all-cause mortality, because when we look at the parallel, I'm fairly certain that, so just kind of rewind for a second from a physiology and biochemistry perspective, when you see insulin go up or when someone's insulin resistant, SHBG goes down typically. But also, and I'm not sure if that particular study that he quoted, if there were any sort of confounding variables related to metabolic health, but I'm pretty sure if you go the opposite direction and you're basically going low SHBG, and even if it was through like androgens or something like that, there could potentially be some health related consequences there. And who's to say that when you do lower it, you're not going to have side effects from the androgens that you are taking. So that's where that would be a definite downside. But first things first, I think a lot of people miss the reason it's climbing in the first place. It could just be climbing based on your diet, lifestyle, and micronutrient status. So figure out why it's climbing, and then don't just like add an oral because you want to drop your SHBG. You know what I mean? So start there. And then also understand that when you impact these different factors in your lab work, these systems don't exist in isolation. That's also one of the reasons, even though the book is more of like a beginner to intermediate metabolism and physiology, it's not advanced by any means or designed to be a textbook. What I want people to understand is when you start to mess with these different systems, whether it's related to your energy intake and expenditure, or your thyroid hormone, like all these different things, you're impacting other systems. They're all connected too. I mean, we were even talking before the podcast about other different bodily systems, whether it's your gut health or anything else. They're not existing in isolation. So when you start to tinker in one area, you may end up with unwanted side effects in another area if you're not paying attention. But I'm pretty sure that's a little Serrano pearl where there's something around low SHBG and all-cause mortality.
Yeah, I'll ask him about that tomorrow. I do know one thing that he's been on me about for the last 3 years is there is DHEA does play into the all-cause mortality. Mm-hmm. So he wants that high.
Oh, like yeah. He definitely, he loves that for both all-cause mortality and I think immune health too. He'll go like super high with DHEA in men, so women should not necessarily do that right at the gate. Mm-hmm.
Perfect. Well, I wanted to kind of like pivot if that's okay with you.
Sure, let's pivot.
Pivot away.
Because being in nutrition, you know, in training, we have a lot of like little camps, if you like. You've got like people who enjoy conjugate training, high frequency training. You've got the high volume approach, the intensity approach. You know, there's a bit of bickering and back and forth and whatever, but compared to what you see in the nutrition world, where your nutrition almost becomes like your religion. You know, like if you tell a keto dieter that keto is actually maybe not optimal, it hits hard, right? So I admire you going into that field because when you start playing around with food a lot of the time, also then you're dealing with things that usually stimulate emotions a lot in people, you know? So I wanted to just kind of talk about how do you deal with, say, for example, when you have to deal with clients who have maybe entrenched themselves in one dieting culture for one. So it could be keto, it could be fasting, it could be veganism, you know, whatever it might be, but it's actually not benefiting them. Like, how do you start going around and navigating that? Because a lot of the time it hits a sore point, right? And it's very difficult.
Hold that question just for a second, because the first question I'd want to have on that is, are they really? Right? So if they are in this camp, like I'm in the keto camp, are they really, or are they pounding ho-hos in the closet most of the time? Yeah. Right. So let's make an assumption that they're really in that camp, because from what I see, you know, like in real world, they're normally not. Like they say that they are, but they're not.
Yeah. They just want it to be part of their identity. So they belong to something.
Yeah. That was going to be the first word I use, is their identity. But Dave makes a great point, which is a lot of people think they are following a particular diet style. Like they think that they're in ketosis, and they're actually not. They're doing like a slightly bastardized low carb diet that's not actually putting them into a state where they're truly following a ketogenic approach. I see this probably right now online. I think plant-based like veganism and like carnivore are probably the worst. I think keto's kind of that's calmed down a little bit. Just from my perspective, I see more people not understanding the risks of eating solely plants and not being an omnivore, not having any sort of animal byproducts or anything like that, which the risk factors would include micronutrient deficiencies, zinc, folate, B12, vitamin D, omega-3s, like the list goes on. So plant-based, huge. And then carnivore, I think just due to popular influencers and conversations online right now, those are probably the two biggest camps.
Where would the Mediterranean diet fall within that?
I don't think that's that extreme. I think there's actually data to support it. I actually did a podcast one time. I'm like, is this the best named diet? You know, if someone was going to be super passionate about something and they were omnivorous, they ate lean proteins, they had some antioxidant rich carbohydrate, and they had some good quality fats, like that's not the worst. There are far worse things that could happen from a nutrition perspective. So I don't view that as dogmatic. I think it could be improved. So some people will go to that diet style and they'll overdo certain foods, right? So they think they're Mediterranean, but they're like overeating nuts, which are, can easily overshoot your calories, or you're not getting enough protein. Or maybe, you see this with paleo. It's like if you're actually an athlete, it would be harder, unless you're eating like a crap ton of potatoes, to actually get your carbohydrate needs on paleo. So it's like, okay, are you like paleo plus maybe you add some white rice or something that's easy to digest, get your carbs up, or using other sources of things to help there. So I really don't have a problem with someone who's like pseudo Mediterranean diet style.
I threw that out because as somebody with cardiovascular history, that everybody says exactly what you do, right? From the cardiologist, Serrano, to all these other people. Like if that's that, so then you go back and I wonder, like, then why is this not one of the more popular ones? If
it's not extreme and it doesn't get attention, and it's hard to make money off of it, right?
Like everybody's kind of behind it, is like, this is a good healthy way. Just pivot a couple things on that, but it's always this freaking extreme of, like you said, the carnivore. It blows my mind.
We just need to remarket it.
Well, it's a bad name.
Another book. Just take the Mediterranean diet, call it something else,
But they always got to pick like the most radical things.
Yes, of course.
100%.
To be able to popularize.
And then they can sell something on the back end, which is usually either it's either supplements, a meal plan, something that goes with the dogma, right?
Like a diet that requires supplements kind of like in itself tells you there's deficiencies, right?
Right, exactly. So it requires that. And I'm not I'm very situationally pro supplements. Sure, I think supplements can be great for people if they know why they're, I want people to just, informed consent is big. Like, why are you doing what you're doing? And you mentioned that you kind of feel for me going more the nutrition route. You know, I feel the same way. Like I look at you guys and I see people arguing about stupid shit related to training all the time it's like, no, Nancy does not need to worry about the angle of her elbow. She needs to actually get into the gym 3 to 4 times per week. You know, I just see that way too often. It's like consistency first, and let's get you actually doing some key foundations that are going to make a like, what are the absolute like big rocks and low-hanging fruit for this person? Probably getting them consistently training. Let's get them going for walks. Let's get them sleeping. So I see training, and I view that the way you guys see nutrition of like, oh my God, there's all these arguments. And I'm like, yeah, there's literally people who have established themselves and their careers in training based off of arguing with other fitness professionals or arguing with other trainers or people who are into that particular thing. Now on the nutrition side, I think there's much more of a monetary gain, or the argument is used to gain attention online, because when you have this massive point of differentiation, you can use it to draw attention. And we know how social media is. It's like clickbait.
What has a bigger reach too, nutrition in general, because everybody will fall into that. If my mom or, they don't even
everybody
have to train. Everybody eats.
Yeah. Everybody eats. And usually there's some sort of monetization behind it. And it's very easy. I mean, people will follow these different diet styles and very sheep-like, just dogmatic. So-and-so says I need to do this, so I need to do this. And bringing it back to, because I didn't really have like a succinct one phrase sort of answer for the book. It's critical thinking. Like Metabolism Made Simple is one of the only nutrition books I know of that doesn't have a specific diet or meal plan that you need to buy or go do at the end. Like I don't say, hey, go buy my meal plan, go follow this thing. I'm like, think about your situation. These are these 5 pillars you should sort of think about. And then from there, you design the best approach for you. And literally, you bought the book, cool. I don't need to sell you some other plant-based eating style to go do that, or carnivore or whatever. I think some people also, what have you eaten for the last several decades? Because it brings you to where you are in this current point in terms of your metabolic health. So how you need to eat right now is quite, in large part due to how you ate how did you eat as a kid? How did you eat as a young adult? How do you train? How do you sleep? What's your lifestyle like? That's going to influence and impact like what nutrition you respond best to.
Are those the 5 pillars that you
those aren't necessarily the 5 pillars. So I talk about, maximizing adherence. It has to be something you're consistent with. Managing appetite. If you're super hungry all the time, it's really hard to stick to a diet. We've probably all seen that play out in real time. I talk about maximizing absorption. Being mindful of your micronutrient status, and then mitigating metabolic adaptation. Because in the book, I reference a lot of chronic dieters. So when you're consistently pursuing, or you're trying to perpetually be in a calorie deficit. So think of, you probably have seen ladies in your life have been dieting since they were 12 years old. They've done Atkins, South Beach, Weight Watchers, Slim Fat, all these different approaches. And there are guys who do this too, because they want to be like stage lean year round. That would apply to that type of competitor as well. So if we're not having seasonality in our nutrition, and you're constantly trying to go super low calorie, or like the power lifter who never goes on a diet phase and is always eating super high calorie, the lack of seasonality there is going to be a problem. So mitigating adaptation is just speaking to the food you eat and the way you exercise will lead to hormonal and metabolic adaptations in your body. Kind of bringing us back to that lab work conversation from earlier. So the pillars are basically addressing these different components of sticking to the diet that you're going to follow. How does it actually impact your physiology, which is really both the gut health perspective and micronutrients, and then thinking about the consequences of either chronically dieting, or if you're consistently eating the standard American diet, how that can impact your metabolic health in the opposite direction, which is usually inflammation, insulin resistance, oxidative stress, a lot of longevity related problems. So that's my whole thing, is just like think critically about what you're going to, whether it's the labs and TRT question you asked earlier, or nutrition, or related to your training too. Like, even the sort of analogy I gave earlier, the example of someone online, it's like, understanding the stage that you're at and then being able to apply like what's situationally best for you without just dogmatically following or like blindly following someone just because they have a bunch of followers.
This will be a different rabbit hole, but I think it's one to explore because it's popular right now is you said appetite control, where now we have meds, for that appetite control. So pros, cons.
Yeah. GLP-1s and Ozempic and stuff like that. Okay. So I actually recently did a whole, I think most of the show we ended up, for Power Project, ended up reacting to Oprah talking about GLP-1s, and Weight Watchers has now apologized for saying that weight loss is a willpower related issue. They've like backed up their stance on calorie control and discipline. And now they're like apologizing because I think now they have some sort of affiliation with one of the GLP-1 drugs.
Yeah.
Very interesting.
Yeah.
Also follow the money.
Yeah.
So, we talk about the plant-based eating, carnivore, people selling, organ capsules and all these different things. Well, follow the money. When you talk about some of these things, and I've kind of gone back and forth on my stance on this. If you are like 450 pounds and this is the thing that leads you to actually starting a healthy lifestyle and you stick with it and it gets a bunch of weight off and you're at risk of dying very, very soon because of your weight, I could totally see the application here, right?
Well, it's going to help. What about a bodybuilder in prep
so
when it gets hard?
Yeah. So for bodybuilders, and if you're not doing the basics and you are going to be hungry, right? In a calorie deficit, I think people just like need to accept that if you're dieting intensely, you will get hungry. The concern I would have from a bodybuilding perspective, or let's say someone's cutting weight, you have a lot of powerlifters listen to this, strength athletes. If you are cutting weight and you are going low calorie, you are already going to have not only those hormonal and metabolic adaptations, but we were talking before the show about gut related changes. And so when you have consistent use of GLP-1s, you can potentially impact or impair your gut motility. So that's my biggest concern for a healthy population is you're taking someone who they're already insulin sensitive. So let's compare these two cases, right? So let's say you're like 300-400 pounds, or maybe even more than that. Where what a GLP-1 is going to do is help regulate your hunger and satiety. So essentially there's a cascade of hormones that happen in a post-meal setting that then allow you to regulate and make dietary decisions on a meal by meal basis. If you are completely insulin resistant, you're leptin resistant, you're overweight, you're going to have a very hard time controlling your hunger and overall like regulating your appetite. If you are very, very lean and understanding why you're hungry in the first place. If you're in a contest prep, the reason you're hungry is you've been in a calorie deficit, and naturally as part of metabolic adaptation, what we know in the process of adaptive thermogenesis, thyroid hormone downregulates. If you're not on exogenous testosterone, you would have a decrease in testosterone, but a lot of competitors are obviously on testosterone. We see an increase in cortisol. We see an increase in ghrelin, which is our hunger hormone. And then we also have to consider, leptin as well. So GLP-1 for these people, it's like, well, the reason you're hungry is you're just not giving your body a lot of food. The reason that someone is hungry when they are overweight and obese is they have an incredible amount of dysregulation in the chemical signaling in their body, because muscle tissue behaves, operates, or sends chemical messages that are quite different than fat tissue. So fat tissue is inherently inflammatory. It sits on your body. It causes further dysregulation. Whereas someone who's already lean and has fairly good metabolic health, now in a physique competitor scenario or someone cutting weight for powerlifting, maybe the drugs are impacting their metabolic health, right? Because you're going to see a lit up lab panel. It's not because you're not lean. The reason your lab panel's lit up is because you're taking these compounds that may be, hepatotoxic or, basically causing problems for your kidney, liver, et cetera. So when we look at these two different situations, the person that's potentially benefiting from that GLP-1, it's because it's helping them regulate their appetite in a way to create a calorie deficit, to then make some progress, get weight off, get those slabs of fat tissue off, to try to then kind of get some of that signaling back. And that's where, if you are so far gone to the place where you really, really struggle to regulate your appetite, you're actually going to commit to exercise or nutrition. I view it as something, because I go back and forth on, there's also data to support it helps with neuroinflammation. And a lot of people who are overweight and obese, depression's on the rise, right? Because we have neuroinflammation, neurodegeneration impacts serotonin levels in the brain. Like you're going to be, I can't even imagine. So I really, as someone, I didn't specialize in working with obese and overweight populations, but I've definitely worked with a few overweight folks over the years, more than a few. But the thing we have to understand is their response to food is completely different. And so if this is the thing that gets that person to where maybe they can live an extra 5, 10, 20 years because they finally get this weight off, I could see the benefit. Now, the concern is gut health implications, 100%. There's side effects. There's definitely people who have reported even to the point of like a level of like gastric type paralysis. Some people who stop taking it because they actually miss being hungry. So I think as long as we understand it's not a grass is always, this isn't the grass is always greener on the other side. There are side effects. You need to make an informed choice. Because even in the episode with Mark, I feel like we kind of like hammered on it a little hard, but in the sense that I don't think it's a replacement for learning the basic habits and discipline that's required to be a healthy person.
Yeah.
So if you're going to use it in conjunction with those things and this saves your life, I don't know that I can be the person to judge that. I don't know that that's fair. That's on you. Like it's your body. If this is going to be the thing that helps you, maybe you do it. But then I also see the other side where it's like, Deborah, who needs to lose 7 pounds, is taking a GLP-1 just because it's more convenient than hiring a coach and actually going through the process of a deficit and optimizing her strength training and doing cardio. I don't agree with that, right? So I think if it's like single digit body fat loss or someone who's really just trying to recomp or look better, get in shape for summer, I don't know that that's the appropriate use case. I also see people who are like pulling people off their thyroid meds to put them on GLP-1s just because, okay, well, when you pull that thyroid, you're going to have potential down regulation energy expenditure. So they're trying to offset that by having that person eat way less calories. So that's a problem. And just thinking, well, if you're not hungry and you're not eating, you may run into some micronutrient deficiencies as well. And with that gut motility, we see this both with GLP-1s. So GLP-1s with that slowed motility, you may have what's called gut dysbiosis or bacterial imbalance in your microbiome. So you end up with more overgrowths or this opportunistic bacteria relative to commensal bacteria. So commensal bacteria would be like the good bugs versus the bad bugs, just to use a very layman's term approach. And we even see that with bariatric surgery and gastric banding. There's a very high incidence of what's called small intestinal bacterial overgrowth. So again, you're messing with one bodily system, which is hunger-related hormones and satiety, but now, okay, we're messing with our gut health. What implications does that have? So if you can go to someone and have an informed conversation and based on your labs, your risk factors, your metabolic health, you're like, this is the way I got to go. That's your choice, right? I'm not in a place to, just like if someone decides they want to take TRT or something.
Well, I think these conversations are important because it's widespread, right? So that conversation is going to be going to the general physician and them just saying, oh, you're overweight here.
Right. Well, that's what's happening right now. And I think if we're not discussing resistance training, lifestyle, nutrition, and even the idea of like going for a walk, that's, to me, I think this is not the first line of defense. You're further down. When you get to this point with pharmacology, there may be benefits, there may be side effects. I think as much as we do have research, there's probably more research that's going to come. We also have now a ton of people who are taking this. It's also very expensive. So, we can't charge people to go for a walk outside. You don't have like an easy pass on your head, that like you scan, like you're walking around the green, like let's say you're at the park, right? Oh, yeah, you walk a mile, like all of a sudden, like nobody you don't get like I guess you have to pay like city taxes or whatever to go to the park, but so I guess you're still getting charged either way. But people are making it's incredibly lucrative, these GLP-1 drugs. And so I do think there's probably a degree of bias in scripting. However, is that to say that there's no benefits? I think we'll see more research. There's definitely benefits on when I mentioned the neuroinflammation side, improving insulin sensitivity if you get that weight off. But those are a lot of benefits that would happen if you just lost weight and you exercise. And so let's say you're overweight, you follow a good, let's say you mentioned the Mediterranean diet earlier, right? Tons of evidence on that. If you followed a Mediterranean diet and you maybe strength trained 2-3 times a week and went for some walks, you would definitely improve your neuroinflammation, neurodegeneration. You'd probably be less depressed. You'd probably lose weight, and you'd improve you'd lose body fat, improve your body composition. You'd get stronger. You'd probably feel more confident, and you're also not spending all that money on drugs. So again, remember that a lot of the changes we're seeing, whether it's driven by pharmacology or different diet styles, if we can bring it back to, okay, what happens when a person loses body fat to a degree, like into a healthy range? They will probably get metabolically healthier until they get out of that range. And now you're like 4% body fat stage lean, like your glutes are shredded. Okay, now you've moved out of that healthier window. And now there's a degree to which stepping on stage is unhealthy. And the drug use to do so is, while you can mitigate a lot of the detriments, there's going to be some things you have to account for. Like we've talked about using different supplements and potentially supporting, whether it's glutathione, NAC, different things that can come into play, support that person. But that doesn't mean that the pursuit is inherently like you're not in your state of optimal health when you're 2 weeks out from stepping on stage at USA.
Well, I think what this exposes is there's a gap between, your medical provider, right, and health, because it's just the way our system is. The doctors are there to treat. Right. They're not there to educate. I don't even know if they have the education to educate.
No, they take like a few hours of nutrition lectures in one semester of all year. Or like, let's say they're in school 6 to 8 years, or longer. Most of them maybe take one nutrition class.
Yeah. So we can't necessarily put all the blame on them because that's not what they're educated to do. They're educated to treat. Right. Where the blame comes on the industry, right? The health, fitness, strength industry, to be able to educate and to close that gap. Because I don't see any pivot to where nutrition courses and exercise courses are going to be put into, the doctor's background. It's just in our society, it's just become that's where you go, for your advice.
Yeah, you're sick, go here, and usually there's a script for it. I think there are good, just like with any profession, there are great doctors, and then there are people who basically got their degree and started practicing, and they haven't done any further pursuit of continuing education. They went to med school in the 80s, and they haven't opened any type of, reference, research, scholarly literature. They haven't gone to, other than probably basic renewal of license, like basic shit that they need to do to renew their license.
Which is usually just golfing for them.
Yeah, or like hanging out with pharmaceutical reps. But there's a degree to which there are amazing, so don't just look at it as like, oh, MD or DO or ND or whatever, NPPA. There are great people in all of those fields, but sometimes they're overshadowed by, some not so great ones. And this is where there's like the Chris Rock joke where it's like, American Airlines can't be like, oh, that pilot was just a bad apple, right? It's like, there's like serious consequences. There's life. I think he talks about bad apples and stuff like that. And I think about medical providers. I'm like, well, there's a lot of responsibility there. They take the oath to do no harm. But they're also set up in a system where I do think it's tough. I feel for them in the sense that they don't get a lot of time with each person. In order to have in order to be profitable or have a practice that makes any type of money, it's very hard if you're in an insurance-based model of medicine. So they probably start med school and even leave med school with very good intentions to help people. And I think they care to a degree about health, but then the system that you're sort of indoctrinated into isn't set up for the type of care necessary that can take a lifestyle medicine approach to problems. So, fortunately in my career, whether it's coaching someone online, in person for training or nutrition, you spend a lot more time with people. If you're with someone for, a full hour session, that's, you're going to know a lot about their life. You're going to know about their kids. You're going to know about their job. You're going to know about their past training and diets and things like that. So I think one, it's the context of the situation. Two is the caliber of professional and their intention to actually help people. And third is like, there's a lot of financial interests that probably it kind of muddies the waters a bit, right? Whether it's the insurance industry, whether it's pharmaceutical industry, those aspects are, I don't want to say confounding variables, but there are things that drastically skew the type of care that people receive.
It's my hope that companies like Merrick just keep building and building and building, because there's a proactive component to all that, with the physician, involved at the end, but unfortunately, that's private pay.
Right, cash pay. Yeah, and some people need that. I mean, fortunately, you can do HSA and stuff, but I think for people who work their 9 to 5, they got a W-2 job, they get their benefits, and they're relying on that for their medical care. It's tough, So
I could still make the argument they'd save in the long run.
They would on their medical bills for sure. So I'm definitely someone who would subscribe to the theory that, okay, Are you investing now, or are you going to deal with this when you have metabolic health issues? You're on 7 prescription drugs, your health is deteriorating, you need longer term care, or you need a procedure that costs a lot and then your insurance only covers a portion of it.
Missed work
for sure. And just then there's the conversation of lifespan versus health span, right? Investing now to actually have good quality of life. So in your years that you are alive, what is the ROI on that investment, right? So you're paying a couple $100s for some labs or, a physician appointment, but you're proactive with your health. I think that's pretty untapped in terms of what you can do with that investment, because it's like you have this life in front of you, and well, let's say you're in your 30s, 40s, or 50s, like you could still have a lot of life ahead of you if you get these things in order, right? And then there's a big difference. You'll see people who are 60 to 80 years old, and it's like some look like they're 95, and other people it's like they're in their 60s and you think they're 40, or there's people who are in their 70s and they look like they're 55. So I do think being proactive and making that investment, even if it's not covered by insurance, you do stand to gain in the long term. It's just tough to get out of that cycle, right?
Yeah, we kind of pivoted away from this whole tribal thing.
Tribal nutrition, we can come back to it.
I was going to say with the GLP-1 though, like I think the unsexy answer though is that no drug is inherently good or bad, right? It's the dosage makes the poison, and you need to remember, like, what is the context the drug was designed in? Like, if the drug was designed for the 400-pound individual to lose the first 100 pounds so they could actually...
And it may not be 400, that was strictly hypothetical.
You get what I'm saying, right? Like, for them to lose the first 100 pounds so they can actually get out of bed and walk and go to the gym, or even feel good enough to start thinking about their health, then is it really any different to putting someone on an antidepressant to get them out of a ditch so that they can start being proactive about the things in their life?
But I do think we script antidepressants pretty soon before we talk about anything about nutrition, training, lifestyle, micronutrient deficiencies, gut health.
Yes.
You could avoid a lot of that. And how many of those people who are on things like SSRIs are overweight? Or,
for sure.
Getting your metabolic health will influence your mental health 100%. And we were talking about that a little bit earlier. As far as what you're saying, the context of the application of the drug, it's just like the context of the application of a diet, or the context of the application of training, and what is your goal and what are you trying to do and what is your risk tolerance. If you can answer those questions and think critically about it, you're going to get you're going to arrive at a much better place overall. In terms of what you were saying on the dose makes the poison, I do think with GLP-1s, it's a little different I would look at it as like the totality of the use over a time horizon versus just like the acute dose, because you're still messing with a bodily system. Now, for some people, could they stand to benefit a lot from coming in and overriding that? Potentially. So it's the context, and someone's risk tolerance, I think, is huge. And what was the drug designed to do, I think, is a great question, and brings us, this applies to nutrition. It applies to PEDs, it applies to hormones, it applies to gut health, really everything, even training. It's usually, everyone wants this, like, and this is the polarity between camps. Everyone treats it like a light switch, right? It's really like a dimmer dial, or like if you get in the car and your radio, you can turn the knob up gradually. There's shades of gray. There's a relative level of benefit versus risk, and people treat it like a light switch: on, off, good, bad, yes, no, like yes, go plant-based, no, don't do carnivore, yes, do this, yes, GLP good, no, GLP bad, versus thinking, well, depending on the person, could there be an application for this? And nobody likes that like common sense critical thinking answer anymore, and nobody wants to talk about anything. It's all extreme. Like, I mean, we see this play out in, social issues and stuff too. It's like nobody wants to have a conversation. It's good or bad, black or white, yes or no. It's not, to what degree might this be helpful? Or is this relatively good? Is this relatively bad based on your situation, right? And so a lot of the things that we're doing, it's really this spectrum with nuance in the conversation, and nobody wants to actually have the nuanced conversation. And so I think that's tough. So could someone benefit from that and understand the actual purpose of the drug? 100%. But I think there's a lot of people who either want to paint it, again, because it's a popular topic, this is the worst thing ever, people should never take this, or this is the best thing ever, you need to take it, you need to buy it, like you should 100%, this is like better than any, nutrition, lifestyle, whatever. So I think it's the type of conversations we're having, and understanding, again, where I think we could draw from the dose makes the poison. That would be like cranking the radio with like a 18-month-old in the car, right? Like the baby's going to cry, like because of what you're doing in the context of the situation. Now, if you're with your friends on a Saturday and it's like some adults, you turn that radio all the way up, like you guys might have a good time. So I think just understanding that there's a little bit of like in this conversation, you know, even being able to break that down on an overweight person versus a competitor. I could see the side effects for the competitor, but I could also see where the reason they want to do it is because they're super hungry right now and it sounds super appealing. And so to them, they see that relative benefit. I just want people to also think about the relative risk and then make a decision for what's best for you.
Yeah, I like your example of the volume dial, because for the physical side, I've always tried to explain this as, you know, old school equalizers, which people may not know.
Right.
You know, you had
you're
20
like bass
different
and
dials.
treble. Yeah.
So if each one of those dials was, here's absolute strength, here's explosive strength, here's strength endurance, here's mobility, here's flexibility, here's, you know, however you want to run that out, you can jam them all up as high as they go, and you're going to suck at whatever you do. But each one of those, if you're a power lifter, you know, absolute strength is up, you know, explosive strength, not all the way up, but up. Strength endurance a little bit lower, flexibility probably a little lower. And then once it's all balanced out, you have the sound of the power lifter, right? So the bodybuilder is going to have different dials, you know, a gymnast will have different dials. And that's the nuance, you know, and what you're essentially saying is when you're dealing with just lifestyle factors and it's Gen Pop or whatever it is, they all have these dials as well.
Yeah, protein, carbs, fats, you know, what is your activity level? Same thing from nutrition. So everything Dave just outlined from a strength training perspective, you could carry that over to, you know, micronutrient needs.
Yes.
Well, if you're pregnant or nursing, that's going to go up. If you're a guy who's super active and you're doing 2-a-days and you're sweating a ton, okay, maybe you have different vitamin, mineral, electrolyte needs, your macronutrient needs relative to your energy expenditure versus if you're super sedentary, you know, all of those things tie together as part of this conversation. So yeah, it's like having those different parts of the equalizer that you can drive up. Well, okay, we're trying to improve body composition. That's a different goal than performance. Performance, if I'm super low calorie or I'm not eating enough carbohydrate and dietary fat, well, under eating, under sleeping, those things would be relative risk factors for injury. Okay, so what's your tolerance for injury given what your physical pursuit is? If you're training for the Olympics or you have a big meet coming up or you're going to nationals or something like that, your risk tolerance for injury is probably low, right? So what do we need to do from a nutrition perspective? Do we need to bring this person to maintenance calories? Do they need to be in a surplus? Is there a season for a deficit? And if we are doing a deficit, should it be more accessory work, right? Or maybe we're doing some hypertrophy related training and low risk movements to preserve muscle mass, but we're not doing like high risk, you need a high level of competency to execute the movement, you know, things that are going to be demanding to a place where they are going to increase that risk, right? So I kind of view it's just toggles. Right?
Yeah, well, I think a difference with biomarkers, say blood work, is there are kind of ranges that are set, right, which are kind of where they should be, but that doesn't mean those are optimal because they're based upon average. There's a difference between the average and optimal.
Yeah, your blood work is more the outcome versus I think the dials we're talking about. So when you mentioned like absolute strength versus explosive strength versus flexibility, that would be the training modality that you're pushing. And then I view it as, okay, are you trying to create a power lifter? Like if you had like a Dave Tate Elite FTS easy bake oven and you could go put an athlete in there and like spit them out. Well, where you would put the equalizer for what you're trying to do with a power lifter versus a bodybuilder versus a strongman competitor, CrossFitter, that's going to be different.
Yeah.
So what I'm saying is to get the result with whether it's your goal is, so health to me, like health optimization and longevity may be a different end of the spectrum than performance. And like when you're in a season of performance or aesthetics, performance and aesthetics should be done for a season and a period of time when you have a goal. And then when you're not in that goal, you have like a health phase, right? So you're spending some time focusing that. Now, maybe you're just a Gen Pop mom and dad like lifestyle person, you probably are going to spend more time in the health phase department than, you know, someone who's trying to step on stage at the Olympia or someone who's trying to, you know, compete at the Arnold or they've got, you know, a big competition coming up. So when we look at it from that perspective, understanding that's where the seasonality and approach is coming in, because if you're always trying to push that performance phase, like you're either eventually going to get injured or maybe your health let's say you're an enhanced athlete, that's going to really compromise the health side of the equation. If you're a physique athlete always pursuing aesthetics, eventually there can be a detriment to performance. Like, it's very hard to have absolute strength and explosive strength and flexibility and all these things at very low levels of body fat, eating very small amounts of food, especially for larger dudes. That's going to impact them. So I view it as when you're referencing that EQ, I'm viewing that as the training modality and the programming, and then the lab marker would be the result of, okay, you have someone who's prepping for a powerlifting meet and they're running a bunch of stuff and they're training a lot right now. Food's in a certain place. Maybe they have to make weight or they don't. That's going to have a particular impact on their metabolic health. The labs are like the blueprint that tells you on that given day, what does their internal health look like? And relatively speaking, how does that internal health correlate with the training and their quality of life and how they currently feel? Because a person can also feel good or bad given a lab value, right? Like, you could use testosterone level as an example. Someone could be at a 600 and someone else could be at a 600. They don't feel the same. So there's still a biofeedback and quality of life conversation, and there's the labs part. But the labs are more your outcome, just like scale weight or reps with the bar or the pound, the amount of weight on a barbell. That's a byproduct of the training you've been doing. It's not necessarily just like the preceding factor, right? So when we talk about labs, remember that that's a reflection of your metabolic status quo because of what you've been doing for days, months, years, decades, and things you've been following over a period of time.
I think like an overarching principle you kind of touched on there is that people forget that whatever the endeavor is, whether it's pushing absolute strength, dieting down for extended periods of time to get to super low body fat, whatever that envelope is, how hard you push that also has to come with a down phase that mirrors it. So the longer and harsher you diet for, the longer you need to be out of the deficit for to get back to optimal health, and so on and so. But that's the bit people don't want to plan or think about, because that's not the phase where I'm making gains, bro. Scenario,
right. It's not sexy. I think it could be viewed as two things, either the length or duration. So think about, now let's use nutrition as an example. I talk about the depth, duration, and frequency of dieting. So if you were in a super steep cut or you're trying to make weight and you did so very quickly, you probably had to, the depth of your deficit or how low you had to go with your calories in a rapid period of time was probably pretty aggressive. Duration would be versus someone, let's say they're a natural bodybuilder and they take like 6 months to prep. The duration was long, and then eventually there was depth to it. And then frequency would be like the person who does like 7 meets or 7 shows in a year. And it's like, oh, you don't really get an off season. So if you think about depth, duration, and frequency, that can really help you steer your nutrition, because if someone's dieted super, super frequently, or they've gone super deep with their calories, or the duration of the diet was very long, those 3 factors are kind of a recipe for some of the adaptations that we talked about. And so to mitigate that, I kind of look at it as like, okay, do we have 2 out of 3? Okay, if this was this person's tried every crash diet, every fad diet, the depth is there and the frequency is there because you've been on like 12 different diets over the last X period of time. Then I'm going to kind of trust and verify. So if this is an athlete, they're probably more precise versus if this is like Jenny down the street who says that she's doing keto, but she's actually not, because she's like not in ketosis and overshooting her calories. She's not actually in a deficit. So for that person, we got to kind of trust and verify what they're doing. They felt as though they were pursuing a diet phase, or they thought they were in a deficit, but they actually didn't achieve it and stick with it for a long period of time. So the depth isn't really there, but that type of person who's always hopping on the bandwagon diet, the frequency is a factor. So when thinking about nutrition and people planning their phases, yes, there's I understand what you're saying, where it's like, cool, you just dieted really hard for 16 weeks. Now you need to have an equal phase of timeout. It's not always 1 for 1. It could be depending on how quickly you get your calories up or how your tolerance for gaining body fat. You could alleviate some of the symptoms of dieting relatively quickly. In terms of something like reverse and recovery diets, that's where that would play in. Or, you were talking about androgen use and androgen exposure earlier, right? Like eventually there's a side of the coin where you do need to take some time off. If you don't take a break, and I don't mean like a break from the gym or deload, but if you don't move into a different season, your body will almost force you to. So you need to kind of plan your seasons. It's basically, seasons of nutrition is like periodization with your blocks and training. So if you have some seasonality to it, it's a lot less likely your body is going to literally force you into a different season. So maybe you didn't intend to take that health phase, but let's say you're competing and you're trying to do, we've used physique. This is, something that I think comes up a lot with bodybuilders and physique athletes, especially after competitions. Like they want to do the next show and the next show and the next show, or someone misses a lift just barely. And so they want to hop in at the next meet. And it's like, okay, but understand that by pushing this, you may need this health phase after. And if you don't take it, your body may force you to take it at some point. And you're not going to know when. So do you want to plan for it, or do you just want it to show up one day when you're like, oh shit, now I need to actually take that time?
Yeah. Well, I'm laughing myself right now because as an entrepreneur, right? So as a business owner, my body just basically it was just forced to take it because I didn't take it.
Right.
I got the markers to kind of show that. So my point there is it doesn't have to just be a competitive athlete. It can be somebody that's working 80 hours a week, or different focuses on
lifestyle too. Yeah, for sure.
And
like think of someone traveling a lot, jet lag can make a big difference in your markers. So I use the athlete examples because I know your audience, you do have a lot of people who are strength athletes, but in terms of, let's say you are not competing, this could show up in terms of your life. Like maybe you got a newborn at home, or you have a significant life change, or you're changing time zones, or you have a lot of stress at work. Maybe you've become the primary caretaker for an older relative. This is just when life happens. It does not need to be, honestly, sometimes the way that powerlifters and bodybuilders may structure their lives, like they may be a little bit more isolated from that versus if you're a business owner and you're responsible for a lot of people, you don't get a choice if you got to show up or not. It's like you've got a business to run, mouths to feed, people to take care of. So sometimes people who are entrepreneurial or are an executive or someone who's higher up in an organization that has a lot of responsibility, those people need these health phases too. It just
having
looks
been on
different.
both sides, I would say it's more important to me now than it was when I was competing.
Yeah.
Because when it crashes, then you have to deal with,
you got to clean up
you still
the
got to
mess.
do everything while cleaning up the mess. It's a lot, and you got to do it with less stress.
Yes.
Which becomes a different, coin. Now, when you say seasonality, and it's kind of related, but not related. And I understand what that means because it's in everything. It's in business. It's in all these different things. But something that always rings in my mind is one of the conversations I had with Eric several years ago was the seasonality of food and what's available in each region. And now granted, now we have availability to kind of everything. So the conversation was step back and act like it was 20 years ago. What foods were available during what seasons? That's what you should eat during that time period. I don't really remember why he said that, but that would create that seasonality with the micronutrients based upon what's available and what's not. Does that make any sense to you in any way?
Yeah, it makes sense. And also people tend to be repetitive in their intakes in terms of food variety. So I know based on the patient population that Dr. Eric sees, and he does have a lot of athletes, it's like chicken and rice, and rice, right? So I think he does that to try to create a more intentional array of micronutrients. Based on food availability, is it a problem if you eat like a citrus fruit when it's not actually growing?
I get that.
I wouldn't.
This is more leaning into it when it's available.
I think when it's available, if you lean into that, I don't see a problem as long as most people, and just taking into account that based on our current food production, the way our system works, a lot of our foods have sort of diminished in micronutrient quality anyway. So some people may need to still spot check and support themselves with a good quality. Maybe you need mineral supplementation. Maybe you need support of a certain vitamin. Let's say you're following a vegan diet. You probably do need B12, zinc, folate, iron, vitamin D. So part of it is how you've been eating. And I think he'll make the joke sometimes, like the best diet is the one that you're not currently following. And I think that's what he's speaking to more in the seasonality. And I also try to remember when professionals state an opinion, I try to look at the context of who has this person been either coaching, treating, or advising. Eric advises a lot of athletes. Athletes tend to be fairly habitual in certain ways. They tend to go to the extreme on certain things that the average Gen Pop client does not do. So for that person, I think that advice is good advice because most people don't actually, I saw this, I got brought in on a case. This was about 2 years ago. This was a women's physique Olympia competitor. And because of repetitive protein, vegetable sources, a number of things, she was basically had iron deficiency anemia, a lot of other markers lit up in her serum blood chemistry. And simply by changing, had insane amounts of inflammation. They were using a number of different compounds, not over the counter, to try to like remedy the situation and get through and continue the prep. And simply by rotating foods, moving from, let's say the person's eating a lot of chicken or fish, including like a ruminant-based proteins, a lean like venison, bison, lean ground beef, whatever. A lot of people will get caught up. Yes, you need to account for the macronutrient aspect, but by switching to that, what nutrients are we getting? And then rotating, like even taking vegetables from always having green beans or always having broccoli to you move to, okay, this person had spinach and bell pepper or something like that, right? There are benefits that can be had from making that adjustment. And for that particular person, made a huge difference in progress photos, lab work, there was not a huge net calorie change. If anything, the person might have been eating more, but the actual aesthetic appearance was completely different. So for Eric's population, I think it makes a lot of sense. For the only issue I would have with that for a general population client is most people who are just doing this as like a lifestyle struggle with consistency. So if you get too rotational with it, and they don't have the building blocks, I think they could very easily be eating very widely varying amounts of certain things. But if, let's say, we're just substituting types of potatoes or types of fruit, and your servings of the things are staying pretty similar, I think it could be done very well.
I think with the definition of the demographic is you have, the section over here that you're talking about are the athletes, right? Then the Gen Pop. But typically, and probably most people that are listening to this, they're amateur strength athletes. So in the gym, they're athlete, but outside of the gym, everything that they're doing is exactly identical to the same issues that Gen Pop has. So they live the Gen Pop life. They're not sleeping well. They're not eating well.
But then they want athlete results.
Yes, and they want athlete results. So when they hear conversations of, talking about health with Gen Pop, they tune that out because it's like, oh, that's not me. That's my in-laws. That's my sister. That's my neighbors. But that's not me. So then they don't want to listen, to where outside of the 5 hours per week that they may be in the gym.
Yeah, they're not exempt from it.
Yeah, exactly. And then 5 hours, let's say actual training, right? The time under tension, 15 minutes for most people, per week, if you get down to that. Outside of that, they're all Gen Pop. Yeah. So all these things that we're talking about probably apply even more to them because they are putting that extra work into there. But sometimes it may not be more, right? Because if you take somebody that has a labor job that's Gen Pop, I could probably argue that their health and their work capacity in many ways could be higher than the person that's training 3 times a week as a strength athlete in the gym, watching Netflix all the other time. So I just wanted to slip that point in there for the people that are listening to realize that outside of the gym, most of you guys are Gen Pop.
Yeah. And the reason they're not making progress is not always because of the perfect program in the gym. It's 100%. The 23 hours, okay, cool. You were in the gym for an hour today. What did you do the other 23 hours? And that's a huge driver. It's not to say like your program is still very important and executing that program is incredibly important, but what you're doing those other 23 hours is it's going to impact what happens when you walk through the door of the gym.
I think more so because everybody at the top is all using a different program. You can't sit there and say, this is the perfect powerlifting program, or this is the perfect bodybuilding split,
right?
Or whatever it is. It's all nuanced.
Do you think people just forget, or there's a disconnect that, when most people who get into the gym are trying to achieve, what you might call some kind of super health, like a physique that's well above what the average human physique would look like in general state, right? But how can you achieve that level of super health if you're not healthy? First, do you understand? Like if you don't have the bedrock and the foundation, how do you expect to be escalating above that to achieve all these things that the average person cannot do?
It's a great question. I think people underestimate the power and the response to stimulus when you're healthy. So whether that be drugs, supplements, nutrition, you were even talking about this the other day. It's like when people are coming out of a show into their off season, and this could apply for someone even if you are a recreational athlete or enthusiast, this is still going to apply to you. Is you push to a point where then you become insulin resistant and you're less receptive to the stimulus, or you have inflammation or you have gut issues, and that becomes the barrier that's there. I think that underlying health makes you respond better to those other variables. So if you can actually get yourself in a good place, your lifestyle's good, you're sleeping good, nutrition's in a good spot. Then even if you toggle the nutrition or you change the training, or for people listening to this who do happen to dabble with performance enhancement, your response to that will be better. And you'll also be able to probably recover, get back to a better place of health if you're not constantly in the gutter with those things. I think if you're redlining it and you get to a place your labs are bad, your nutrition's led you to a place where you're insulin resistant, you have inflammation, your gut's jacked up, you're going to spend as much time trying to get back. You're going to spend equally as much time trying to get that back on track as you are actually making progress. And realize that when you have these internal health related issues or physiological dysfunction, it will be counterproductive to building muscle or getting stronger, because it can impact you, whether it be physiologically from a hormone perspective, or your gut and your absorption of nutrients, but also neurologically too. If you feel like shit, you're probably not going to perform. I mean, there's still something to be said about some days you will feel like shit and you may have a great training session in spite of that, but that is not necessarily, shouldn't be expected to be your go-to. That shouldn't be your norm of all 5 training sessions a week. You walk in feeling like shit and then you're like, oh, I feel fantastic, right? It should be like, that's a pleasant surprise if it occasionally happens, but that shouldn't be your default.
Mm-hmm. So we went down the rabbit hole of Ozempic. So let's go down the rabbit hole of metformin, right? Because that was super popular. It's kind of become a little bit not as popular. Maybe Ozempic took the place, of the metformin, because that was another one, that kind of, I don't know where it is on the bell curve now, but it was, riding real high on that bell curve, or why kind of like Ozempic now is on that upswing. It seems to me like, metformin is on that downside, of that. But when you're dealing with the insulin sensitivity, it's a lot of the people that fall in that demographic I'm talking about fall into that camp of, fuck it, I'll just take this, right. And not have to worry about it.
Yeah. So metformin is, the similarity would be that they can improve insulin sensitivity, but they're doing it through a slightly different mechanism of action. And metformin is popular, I'd say, for competitors in like off season, but a lot of people too, from a performance enhancing perspective, if they're using insulin, right, they're already doing something to knock down that blood glucose. So metformin, what it's not going to do, and one of the reasons a GLP would be intriguing, right? If you're super hungry all the time, GLP is actually going to impact appetite to a stronger degree. And that may be why metformin has lessened in popularity, because the avenue through which it's working, you may see improvements in insulin sensitivity, but it may not make a drastic change in terms of your appetite. It's not really designed to be an appetite suppressant. So I could see why that's where it would fall off. I think also herbals like berberine have grown in popularity to where people just opt to take a berberine product instead of taking metformin. It's also more widely available. But in terms of studies and like human research on these things, we definitely have copious amounts of data on metformin and berberine from a glucose control, glycemic regulation, insulin sensitivity perspective. And because of that, there's probably a little bit more well-known safety data, implications, deficiency risk of depleting, whether it's like B vitamins or otherwise. I do think it got really popular to where people are kind of popping it like candy for longevity, not realizing that there are other ways to improve your insulin sensitivity. You could literally eat your meal and go for a 5-minute walk, and you would probably improve your postprandial glucose. Same thing if you're having digestive issues. You go for a walk post-meal can really help with bloating and motility, versus people who are going to jump on like prokinetic medication or something like that. So it all, again, falls through, okay, are we using the tool of nutrition and things with your lifestyle to get that glycemic control where we want it to be? Like sleeping improves your insulin sensitivity. Going for a walk improves your insulin sensitivity. Training, right? If you're done correctly, that training stimulus is going to help build muscle, which is like a sink for glucose. So you're doing a lot of things there that can help with that. I think people were probably looking at it in a number of ways. One is like, could this insulin sensitivity aspect help with the aging and conversation around? Because for a long time, people just pushing like insulin resistance inflammation is the reason that everything happens, right? That was a huge part of the conversation, I think, is why it grew in popularity, but also maybe people who were trying to dabble in performance enhancement and maybe taking certain things that impacted their blood sugar, but then maybe not using insulin. So then is metformin like this middle ground? I think that's where people started to scoop it up, at least in the athlete side of things. But as far as why it's probably diminished in popularity is just it's overshadowed by GLP-1 right now. For sure.
In the world of weight loss, why do you think those drugs, for example, have taken on popularity compared to drugs that work on like ghrelin and leptin? And I can't for the life of me remember the drug that I wanted to bring up that acts on leptin now, but basically, there are drugs that affect ghrelin and leptin levels that basically make you not feel hungry on a neurotransmitter level. Why do you think like those have become widespread, whereas those have not so much?
To some degree, it probably has to do with the readiness to market of like when things are in clinical trials and then they see an opportunity to monetize something, they see efficacy, they have safety data, they're probably just going to push it. I don't know why one might be pushed harder than other. That's probably the reason, is it went through like phase 1, phase 2 clinical trials, the speed and timeline of drug development relative to the market and need with, you think about how many. I saw a statistic, this was from Lancet recently, and that's a very popular journal, that obesity is now becoming like as big of an issue as hunger, or will like kill more people than like starvation and malnourishment and things like that. So I'll have to try to find the exact, but the general idea is now we've got an issue where people are so overweight that this is now becoming as much of the conversation as feeding people, right? Which used to be a huge concern. So now with so many people being overweight, we've created this total addressable market. I think the GLP-1s fit the bill for that. Now, when you're saying on a neurological level, understand that because of the gut-brain axis and the way that satiety signals work, those hormones are not existing in isolation. So it's like, remember the same way that we have messenger apps on our phone, like you've got your Instagram DMs, Facebook, WhatsApp, whatever, maybe you got Telegram, Voxer, email, Slack. So you've got all these different apps. They're going to send a chemical message. The purpose and like action of that message, and I'm trying to break this down to like very layman's terminology to not get super, super complicated. Understanding GLP-1, or basically glucagon, is part of that satiety system, that post-meal, both insulin, glucagon, and then from like a medium to long-term perspective, leptin, are working to help with that hunger and satiety. So glucagon is still going to impact you from both what's going on from that peptide perspective or hormonal perspective, but it is going to impact the brain as well in terms of what's going on in your ability to regulate your hunger and cravings. Leptin, as far as the development of those drugs, I'm not as familiar with the research, but I would gather that there's probably a financial portion of that equation, or safety data, implications, and understanding that this might have been a more immediate way to kind of come in, target a specific system and get the outcome that they were looking for. But technically, both glucagon and leptin play a role in satiety.
Cool. Thank you. I mean, we've mentioned a couple of times now about diet, nutrition, gut health kind of feeding back to neurotransmitters and mental health and mood and all that. So I think that's kind of worth exploring more. So like, I know it's kind of hard to summarize, but how would you sum up the effects that a person's diet can have on their mental well-being, their mental health on a day-to-day basis?
Yeah, so probably the biggest one, because I think a lot of people talk about, your neurotransmitters are made in your gut. So I don't want to beat a dead horse there. I want to provide an alternative perspective. There's a couple of things that happen with the standard American diet, Western eating. Most people who are consuming a standard American diet, you end up having intestinal permeability, or AKA leaky gut. Leaky gut's this popular Instagram term, but scientifically it's just intestinal permeability. It's not like you feel like you're going to shit your pants and you need to run to the bathroom. It's like actually your gut barrier function. So if you think of your gut has a degree of permeability to which is okay, and then there gets to be a point where it's detrimental. So in the Western diet, what happens is we have LPS, or lipopolysaccharides, that basically get out of the gut. It's again, the gut is not in isolation. It's not like Vegas. Like what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas. There are implications of gut health on both hormonal systems, our immune system, and the gut is also a center for inflammation. So when you don't have good gut health, what tends to be happening is not only will we have poor micronutrient deficiency, which is a key aspect of neurological health, and having those both neurotransmitters, just general mood, energy, well-being, important processes like methylation. But then also when we have that intestinal permeability, you're creating a state of inflammation and activating the immune system. And when you have that state of inflammation, I think what's underestimated in the conversation around the gut and mental health is when you have that gut inflammation, the impact on the brain is we begin to have a less favorable cascade. So think of, with hormones, if you're someone who's like trying to optimize your testosterone, you understand what aromatase is, you understand testosterone, estrogen. Well, you have these enzymes across your body, things that convert like T4 to T3 for thyroid hormone. You have testosterone, estrogen. You have testosterone to DHT is 5-alpha reductase. People will block that if they're worried about like hair loss and things like that. Well, you have cascades of neurotransmitter production as well, that basically, if you, let's say, instead of resulting in something like serotonin, you can end up with something that's neurotoxic. So when you have high levels of inflammation in the body, you're insulin resistant, poor gut health, you can potentially be pushing essentially that mechanism or that cascade where we're ending up with things that are, instead of being beneficial or helping you feel good, you're literally in a state where it is detrimental to your neurological health. So layman's terms, most people talk about, okay, good gut health is important because your neurotransmitters are made in your gut. Well, the conversation, basically what I'm saying today is, yes, that's an important topic of conversation, but let's also talk about when you don't have optimal absorption, you're not going to have optimal micronutrient status. Micronutrients are important for mood as well. And with our standard American diet and just the way most people eat, we tend to, and other aspects of lifestyle like sleep and things like that, you may have intestinal permeability that creates more inflammation, activates the immune system. And when we have those things present, that's also impacting what's happening at a brain level too, not just only in terms of serotonin production. So it is kind of this broader physiological conversation of one thing impacts the other. When people have poor gut health too, that can create, we talked a little bit about dysbiosis earlier. So people eating that standard American diet tends to, what happens is, let's say it's low in fiber and micronutrients, it's high in calories, but basically it's hyperpalatable foods, not very micronutrient dense. We're not necessarily feeding that good gut bacteria. And when we have that state of imbalance in the gut, that also drives inflammation. So it's, when you think about the gut as a center of inflammation, it's both the intestinal permeability conversation, but also what is the balance of the gut microbiome. That's kind of a newer area. I'd say gut health, I don't want to say lags behind, but we're probably going to learn so much over the next 5, 10, 15, 20 years that things will continue to emerge, whether it's around probiotics or around foods that you can eat and things that happen. And they've even done, they'll like swap stool between healthy people and people who are not, and see the downstream implications of that. I think we'll learn so much more about gut health to where we can have like a much more informed conversation about it. But I think the most important thing to understand right now is, yes, what you eat matters not only in terms of the calories, but that food you're eating will literally make up the gut microbiome because it is feeding the gut bacteria. And when you make poor quality food choices, there's also the consequence of what's happening systemically. So instead of just thinking of it as a local problem, okay, this is also having systemic consequence as well. Just like the conversation of what you do outside of the gym is going to impact what you're doing in the gym. The food you're putting in your mouth, yes, it impacts your gut, but it's also going to impact those other bodily systems and can lead to, negative downstream effects as well.
How much of an issue do you think like glutamate intake is then based on the American diet? Because obviously a lot of like branded coffees will have, now we've done a good job of making people aware that MSG is not a great thing to be eating a lot of, right? But now it just gets masked as glutamic acid and other stuff, other additives like that. So, it's still in a lot of coffees, a lot of fast food. Obviously, a high glutamate intake can be neurotoxic if the levels get high enough, but I think that's something that doesn't really get mentioned or talked about.
Yeah, our food quality and ingredients are definitely a problem. I'm not... that would be one area that I think like that research, I'm not as familiar with the particular studies on, glutamate findings and those things. I could see how as more of an excitatory neurotransmitter, that's going to be problematic and speaks to a broader issue of just food ingredients as a whole and additives. We have, the way that the United States works is we basically operate on a generally recognized as safe or if you ever see GRAS, it looks like grass, but there's one S, generally recognized as safe. Whereas in other countries, they have much higher levels of scrutiny around things that are added to food. So different things, whether they be preservatives or anti-caking agents or different things that may be added, or coloring, other things. I think it's the European Food Safety Administration just has much tighter guidelines. So I actually just did a podcast on that, how there's basically people will go over and eat in Europe or go on vacation. They don't have any problems. And then they come back here, they try to eat the same food. It causes issues for them. A lot of times it's those additives. Mm-hmm. Some people are sensitive to thickening agents, gums, preservatives. That can vary person to person, but I do also know that there's research to kind of further support that direction. I'd say the US in general does have a problem with like these things being added to our foods, some of which make it more hyper palatable and easy to consume. Mm-hmm. But as far as what you're referencing in terms of being added to certain coffees, I'm not familiar with like an exact content piece that I can really share on that.
When the question I have when it comes to mental health, right, is like, what is that? Because it's very broad, you know, and it's
kind of an amorphous thing.
Yeah. And it's a topic that comes up a lot of times where it's one of those things where, well, here's something I like to speak about because nobody's really talking about that. I'm like, cool, let's talk about that. And then you talk about it and like, well, what do you mean, you know, by mental health? We can talk about gut health, hormone health, and you have all these different symptoms with that. I mean, are we talking about, anxiety, depression, brain fog? Like, what are we talking about when people will say, well, this will impact mental health? And sure, I don't disagree, but you know, just for my own benefit, how do you navigate those conversations, you know, to be able to even have the conversation that everybody says has to have, but usually ends up with just see a therapist?
The reason I asked you the glutamate question is because like the keto diet is commonly prescribed for people with epilepsy because it will bring down brain levels of glutamate, which will reduce their symptoms because then they've got less excitatory neurotransmitters, which reduces the likelihood or the frequency of seizures. But what we see now with people with high levels of glutamate intake is they're more emotionally volatile, for want of a better word. Like something is either the worst thing ever or the best thing ever, and they swipe back and forth between. So in that specific example, glutamate and glutamic acid is almost like an emotional amplifier, which, you know, if you think about what we're seeing perhaps in younger generations now, maybe playing into the fact that people do seem to be maybe, you know, for want of a better word, triggered more easily and swaying more in that direction. So that was the
keto paper
specific kind of background behind that question.
The epilepsy, and keto, that aspect, I'm definitely there are papers on that. As far as the mental health thing, Dave, this is such a interesting yet slippery slope, right? It's like, I think as anyone who's a health professional, you're a fitness coach, you're a trainer, strength coach, whatever, you know, a lot of what we do, I think, builds confidence in people through raising their self-esteem, because basically you're setting out on this path, you're keeping promises to yourself, and through that execution, you build this bank of evidence of like, hey, I've done this shit, and therefore I feel this way. And so what's interesting in the mental health conversation, it's so amorphous and like not super tangible, because for one person, their good day could be someone else's like worst day, right? It's like and I think we're getting more specific with markers of neuroinflammation and ways to assess someone's mental health and have some way to like quantify things beyond, you know, like a psychology journal coming out with a perceived stress questionnaire and being like, oh, this person perceives that they are super stressed. And it's like, well, if you believe that you are a certain way, you probably will be, like, the placebo effect is like super strong. Or you feel, if you think, what is the quote? It's like, if I think, therefore I am. But it's also like so many other quotes too. I think just understanding, one, with the mental health conversation, super hard to navigate because people all have their own opinion and bias around a lot of things. Two, what's good for one person may not be someone else's like ideal scenario. When people talk about mental health, emotional health, you know, mood is part of that. And then there's all these different sub definitions and classifications that then you're like walking on eggshells to navigate the actual conversation. For me, when I think about it for people, it's like a level of emotional regulation and stability in that. Not to say you'll never have any bad days. Life is hard, but building a level of confidence to show up for yourself, keep promises to yourself and the people around you. not everything's rainbows and butterflies, and it's not going to be sunshine and smiles all the time. So you do have to have a level of resilience with that. And I think you build that fortitude through, these actions that you're doing repeatedly. And even when you don't feel like it, you're doing it, right?
Yeah.
So I think we're missing that part of the conversation of sometimes actually getting to a good place requires some work versus just expecting to like show up and automatically feel super confident in something you've never done before. Instead, normalizing it. I think people might feel less frustrated, upset, angry, defeated if we normalize the conversation of like, hey, you're not going to show up on day one and be an expert. And I think that's where comparison syndrome and social media has made things worse because people see people, they're in different chapters of a different book on a different journey, and then they feel like crap before they've even started versus like, hey, for like day 3, that's really not that bad. I had someone ask in a question box the other day, like, what advice would you have for someone who's like starting over or doing these things? Obviously, they're not in the best place mentally if they feel like they're starting their fitness journey over again. So being able to assess like, this is where you're at, but also not just like putting yourself down because you haven't completed the race yet. So I think really where fitness fits into this, and then in business, is it just becomes a matter of like, you're building self-trust through essentially having a level of personal integrity, showing up for yourself through keeping those promises. You're scaling that over time, and then you do harder and harder stuff. It's like someone who starts with squatting the bar, and then they get to 135, and then they get to 225, and then eventually they're lifting more weight. There's a progressive overload in life too, but I think people are looking at, it would be the equivalent of someone comparing themselves to Thor, and it's like their first day in the gym. But being able to navigate that conversation, just helping them understand where to start to build some traction for them, because people get overwhelmed and then they don't take action, and then they just feel like crap.
Yeah, that's always been interesting to me with that, because if we think back to when we were like 2 or 3, like everything was setting us off. Right. Yeah. I mean, you're throwing fits about everything. And then by the time you're like 14, you're not throwing fits anymore because you can't find the ball under the couch. No. So the evidence is in, how we just grow and evolve, is where I guess if you have the person that's, 25 still throwing fits about what the stuff they were when they were 13, that's probably a problem, to where they didn't have to navigate, through.
But we still have that though.
We do.
Right? Because it's like bad times make strong people, like strong people make, good times make weak people, kind of like the circle goes round and round. I do think there are people still throwing fits about like their ball underneath the couch. And it's like, okay, but you're an adult now. Like, we need to have a level of responsibility. But there are individuals, whether there's a level of lifestyle component or predisposition, there still needs to be I don't want anything I said to come across as like that people don't ever have a problem.
No, we're not doing that.
Yeah. I think people do legitimately have, whether diagnosed or otherwise, like there can be significant obstacles that people face in terms of their mental health journey. But I think one thing that we've lost in our society is understanding that like your physical health, sometimes you do have to work for it a little bit, and it's not just always perfect. And sometimes you need people you can talk to. Sometimes it's through actions you can take. It's also how you feed your body. Do you sleep? Like, there are a lot of people who talk about their mood, but they won't go to bed on time to get enough sleep to be in a decent mood the next day. Or you're not paying attention to your nutrition, or you haven't done anything physically active to actually support your body from an exercise perspective, which can do wonders for your mood. There's actually, I think, nearly as much research to support, if not more, exercise and the effects of physical activity on mental health, anxiety, and depression as, some of these strong pharmaceutical compounds. That's not to say that you can't do, for the right person, do they maybe warrant using both? But again, it comes to the conversation of the first 15 minutes in the appointment. Have we asked someone, hey, what's your sleep like? Do you exercise? If they're not doing those things, maybe we have that conversation first before someone goes on a medication that's very hard to titrate off of, with significant side effects. So I think if people address that low-hanging fruit and they still need more support, whether it be counseling, therapy, medication, et cetera, that's that person's choice to decide what they want to do. But the fact that people in positions that are authority positions or positions of power are not educating on, hey, exercise can actually really improve your mental health. Or for guys, how many guys have low T that are given an SSRI and just said, oh, you're actually just depressed? It's like, no, your testosterone's like 187. Maybe you should actually optimize that, and maybe your mood will be better too because of the neurological aspect of that. So I think as part of this conversation, yes, there is the mental health conversation, but understanding it's a bi-directional relationship. Your mental health impacts your physical health, your physical health and metabolic health impact that. And so if close to like over 80% of our country is metabolically unhealthy, a lot of people are going to be mentally unhealthy as well because of the physiological consequence of that, right? Because of the levels of body fat, because of the poor food quality, nutrient status, low levels of exercise, low physical activity. That's part of what plays into mood, mental, and emotional health too.
Yeah, now, one thing that I've seen just from a personal level, I'm not going to say this is broad, but with, the strength athletes is if I'm navigating that conversation, say it's depression or anxiety, I have them define exactly how that manifests in them. And it's obviously different with everybody. Like, what's the worst depression that you've ever had? There's that. Same with anxiety, and the anxiety, I guess personally, I get more confused about because I'm trying to like figure out how's that different than being psyched up to lift a big weight, so it's just
not being able to come down from that.
Yeah. And that's kind of how but it manifests in different ways. But to your point, in a lot of these times, if it's, the higher, more advanced lifter, if they just start going on walks or putting in steady state cardio a few times a week, that mitigates so much of all this, from their own words, anecdotally, I'm not broadly speaking here, but from their own words that they never are on those big extremes because they just implemented a better fitness profile into their training of walking or 20 minutes a few times a week, steady state cardio.
We're bipedal beings at the end of the day. I mean, at the very basic level, if we're not on our feet and moving around, we're not really doing what we're built to do, I guess. So should it be a surprise that the people who do that less kind of feel a bit out of function and everything's a bit out of whack? I don't think that should
here's what I would
people,
wonder is if those same people are in a calorie surplus, and I can say this was probably me, right? So if they're in that calorie surplus, pretty sure my macronutrients are being met because most of what I'm eating is good and it has the macronutrients. I was always aware of that. Now, all the other crap on top of it, to be in that calorie surplus, it's different today because food's changed, right? So there's more chemicals and shit and all that. So how detrimental is throwing in whatever, right? Pizza, shit, just whatever for the calories. How detrimental is that to them in regards to their training or broadly based mental health? Because it's hard, to get 8,000 calories of all, I don't want to use the word clean because I don't know how to define that with foods either.
Like single ingredient foods or something like, you're having steak and potatoes.
Yeah, I actually had the same question for you basically in terms of if calorie expenditure goes up, does say fiber and micronutrient requirement scale at the same rate, or does there become a point like Dave is saying where because the micronutrient fiber intake scales up slower that there then creates this gap where there's a certain amount of calories that don't really need to provide that because you're already hitting it with the first.
Yeah, I mean, it's junk calories, but I like your question better, right? Because am I actually hitting those needs or not?
I'm going to touch mental. So for years, I would say micros would need to scale at a greater need than fiber. And just in my personal coaching experience of what I've observed, working with a lot of client cases and seeing people hit a threshold where increasing fiber count would no longer be super tolerable or it would be detrimental to their food intake. That doesn't mean that you shouldn't include fiber, but we may need to be creative.
How so detrimental? Just because they're
their gut, or like frequency of bowel movements, bloating, distension, abdominal discomfort. That would be it. As far as your mental health question, I think when we have this conversation around certain foods, I know you weren't saying like, we need to talk about clean food versus people having these meals that are a little bit more of like a treat. I think we've also lost sight of the conversation of what is the context of the meal of like, did you consume that with family and friends? Were you sitting down and enjoying yourself? Or was this like your 4-year-old's birthday party and you're being present as a family member? Or were you eating this in the car driving, not paying attention, shoving your face, not chewing your food, eating in isolation. Because in the mental health conversation too, we have to talk about things like loneliness. I mean, there's evident, like you said, sending these guys going for a walk. Okay, well, natural settings help with stress reduction. Even just putting someone in a green setting versus like a city or metropolitan area can improve your physiological markers of stress and things like, I would assume also mood, anxiety, etc. But I know there's evidence specifically on the stress side of the equation. Then we move to this conversation around food and meals you're eating. Well, if you're having you're attentively eating and your grandma made her homemade pizza recipe or something, or she makes this dessert that you have at Thanksgiving or whatever, that's very different than someone going through a fast food drive-through, pounding the food, or you're shoving your face in the after school pickup line, like on your way to get your kids. So yes, there's still calories being consumed and there's things happening, but understanding that what you're doing, whether it's chewing, being present, not watching Netflix while you're eating the meal. There's so many just things we used to do that we don't do anymore that would be more health promoting, even if the food isn't perfect. I'd still rather have someone, if they are going to deviate, I'd rather it be, hey, I was with my entire family. We had this really nice meal. You know, it's bringing down stress levels in these certain ways versus I can't ever have this food and demonizing this and doing that. And then someone just ends up going off the rails. But also too, I'd much rather have someone, if they are going to eat that food, doing it in that type of setting versus just this like rushed eating, or you went by yourself after the gym, you hit a lift and then you did a tour de food and you went to like Burger King, Taco Bell, Chick-fil-A, like you just completely, and that's not uncommon in powerlifting, right?
Hammered on the way home.
Versus, okay, if you had dinner with your family and your calories were a little bit higher, and if that's a season you're in. But I do think people miss opportunities to make little tweaks that make it much easier to get higher amounts of food in, whether it's like ground meats versus trying to chew steak, 10 times over when you're trying to get your calories up. Having foods that are relatively hypoallergenic, or the difference between white rice versus having something else, or certain ways that you could prepare a potato or something to make it a little more tolerable, including some shakes and things where you're blending the food and essentially making that digestion and assimilation significantly easier, rotating some of those protein sources, using different things that maybe are single ingredient and a little bit higher in calories, not as voluminous. Like, are you putting honey on something, right? There's little ways that you can do that. Different oils, coconut oil, you could have macadamia nut oil, olive oil, avocado oil. There's different things that will crank that up higher. You could cook something in grass-fed butter. There's ways that the caloric density will increase without a substantial increase in food volume, but you do need to be strategic with it. And then bringing it back to the conversation around, and people are also like, this dude's not 300 pounds. What does he know about eating a lot of food? But working with athletes of different sizes, it's all relative. You can take someone out of a prep, and let's say it's a female athlete and she could be 125 pounds and she needs to eat a lot of food to build muscle. That 3,000 something calories for her might be a lot compared to what she was eating before, is double. It's kind of like a guy who normally eats 3 or 4 and then's going up to 6,000 calories. But then looking at a conversation around that caloric intake, did Michael Phelps just eat like chicken and rice and broccoli to get that in when he's swimming and expending so many calories? No. So there are athletes who are going to require not just bodybuilding foods, or it needs to be done so strategically in a way that really helps to facilitate, like that person probably benefits from, they're going to eat whole eggs, not just egg whites, right? We need to get a little bit more both diversity and micronutrients there. As far as the scaling of fiber and micros, there seems to be more of like an individual tolerance level to fiber and different thresholds that some people can get away on a lower calorie diet with much higher fiber counts, and it's not leading to a ton of problems. Other people will be in a situation where you scale their fiber intake and all of a sudden they're super uncomfortable, or they can't get their other meals in, or it leads to digestive problems or changes. You could use something, you can Google this, it's called the Bristol stool chart. You can basically look at how well formed your bowel movements are. Some people, you push the fiber one direction, they went from having well formed bowel movements to like now they're either uncomfortable, they're bloated, distended. The Bristol stool chart changes. So I think we can be strategic with the type of intake that we have. And then as we're scaling, yes, when you are consuming higher calories, micronutrients should scale to a degree. that doesn't mean you need to like quadruple your intake of everything, but I do think people underestimate micronutrient needs, especially in like very large individuals, as that food goes up. But even in a, let's say, more petite competitor or something like that, or a strength athlete, what feels like a lot of food for them, that's still their reality because of what they were eating before. Just because they're not a 350-pound dude doesn't mean that to them getting that food down isn't difficult. Yeah. So you still need to work with the person that's in front of you. And I think adjusting fiber, I've seen little things like, Thorne has this Fibermen product, it's basically sun fibers. What's in it's a soluble fiber that seems to help with some people, especially athletes, when they're trying to regulate bowel movements and bowel form and things like that. That can be a good product, especially if depending on what they need to do with their vegetable intake or fruit intake. Switching things from going from how many people when they're hungry in a diet, they're using things like cauliflower rice, cruciferous vegetables, big salads. Those things can also impact digestion when you overdo it. So you may rotate that person. Okay, let's say this is their off season or they're pushing food. You can still consume fruits and vegetables, but maybe I go to a little bit more fruit, still getting antioxidants and things like that. Maybe my vegetables that I'm choosing aren't so heavy and voluminous and like super filling as far as like calories per gram. Maybe we're going the opposite direction. So I think there's ways to work around it. It's just some people try to scale it quite literally where it's, okay, during prep, I had half a cup of rice and 6 to 8 ounces of steak or whatever, and X amount of broccoli. And then they just try to like increase those amounts versus actually deploying some food rotation, I think can go a long way to help people. Along with, okay, let's say you do have a couple shakes and things. What can you be adding in or doing things in certain meals and kind of sneaking a little bit extra food in without the digestive stress?
Because I think once some guys get on those higher calorie amounts, they will use that as an excuse. Like, oh, well, I only need 2,500 of my 5,000 to come from good sources. That's probably all my boxes ticked. And then I can then it's their excuse to do whatever they want.
That was me, and it worked to a point. Yeah. And to a certain age, I could get away with it.
Yeah, it works until it doesn't. Yeah. And then you get to that point where whether we talked about this off air, usually either ends up being an insulin sensitivity issue or a gut health related concern, or you're just like a tolerance perspective. And people do this on the way down to help with like the psychological aspect of dieting is like a diet break. Sometimes when people are pushing food, they can benefit from these little plateaus where it's like, it doesn't need to be a linear increase each week. You could get to a place, your biofeedback's holding pretty good from like your energy levels are good, digestion's pretty good, you're sleeping okay. Cool, let's ride this out and see how we do. Then you stair step it again versus a lot of times people are just trying to always add every week, or I've got to put down more. But then they run out of runway faster than someone who kind of incrementally went up and then they ride that out for a period of time, see how they can do, they add food again, and then when they have the negative effects, you can back it down a little bit. You don't need to automatically switch phases. Okay, let's go back to where you were, where you didn't have any negative digestive symptoms or you didn't have issues with your blood sugar. See if we can control that. Because if you push it, sometimes people will get to that place and then you got to spend time fixing it. So it's better. This is also maybe just a philosophy thing. It may not necessarily be that this is how everybody needs to do it. But my opinion or philosophy would be, I would be a little patient, not have to go into a state of correction, like a full health phase, to undo the damage of like going up super fast, especially if someone doesn't have that much time to begin with in off season. Now this is also relative to, you're talking about like thousands and thousands of calories over their maintenance. Sometimes people don't need that. And there are situations. So I was thinking of the instance of like a recovery diet versus a reverse diet. For a natural competitor, gaining that body fat initially and doing a larger bump may have greater benefits in terms of quality of life. They may gain a little bit more fat, but they're going to come out of that state of brain fog, poor hormonal dysfunction a little bit faster. So again, look at the client population that you're working with. Some people may need like that little bit of a jump. It's also a psychological thing too. Some people really struggle if all of a sudden in their progress photos or something, they're gaining a bunch of fat really quickly. It's going to be kind of a mind fuck for that person, right? So we have to, that's where, look at the client. What is the sport they're competing in? Or is, if this is someone who's not like officially competing, they're just going for a photo shoot or they want to get lifestyle lean, then we kind of plan the exit strategy around that. But I think with pushing food, people do use it as a little bit of a they'll make an emotional decision and then they'll kind of try to justify with logic of like, oh, well, it would have been hard to get that food in, versus taking a little bit of work, like one day for the week, and figuring out foods that are easier to digest and get down and still getting as much as you can. Because your blood sugar regulation is still going to be very different too on those foods, and your micronutrient status, versus eating kind of empty, I don't want to say empty calories, but let's just say foods that are higher calories and lower in nutrient density, because there's still a value to have that, especially if your goal is like optimal performance.
Yeah. In those scenarios, when someone's going through that gaining phase, then would you encourage people to use kind of their perceived gut health as a marker of when to increase calories? Because most people will just look at the scale, right? But well, the scale hasn't done what I wanted it to this last week or 2 weeks or whatever, but they're struggling from a digestive point of view already. So they're like, well, I obviously need more calories. So that's just their excuse then to bump up calories, as opposed to thinking, well, wait a minute, if I'm not really handling the volume I'm already taking in, I'm just putting more of a problem into the system. What can I do to deal with this calorie load better? And then maybe earn the right, inverted commas, to put it up from there.
So I have a little system I use for this called SHREDS. So it's basically sleep, hunger, recovery, energy, digestion, stress. Think of it as like a little checklist. So if you were to walk through someone's check-in and you're determining if you're going to raise food or not, a lot of times people are only looking at the calories and they're only looking at training. Well, most coaches, when you impact or you make a decision related to training and nutrition, you impact someone's physiology. Very few people take the time to learn and understand physiology, but what's actually happening there is like there's going to be changes beneath the surface. So when we think about gut health, well, gut health would be the D for digestion. There's both qualitative and kind of quantitative components to that. So for digestion, we ideally are going every day, and good rule of thumb would be like 1 to 3 times per day. In situations of super high calories or individuals really pushing food, that could go up a little bit. But generally speaking, when most people are looking at things we want, Bristol stool chart, well-formed stools, look at the frequency and regularity of going. We don't want to be super constipated. That's a problem. We need to be going regularly as part of natural detoxification process that our body undergoes all the time. So when that person steps on the scale, it's kind of like, let's go through our checklist. So let's go through sleep, hunger, recovery, energy, digestion, stress, both qualitatively and quantitatively. So that'd be like, how much are you sleeping? How well rested do you feel? Then use those little things to be your compass for what direction you should head. If my digestion is literal crap, then I need to spend some time cleaning that up. Unless it's like I'm very close to a deadline, right? We would expect those markers to deteriorate. And these are things to use in between labs. Like you would look at your labs, see how you feel at that time point when you get the labs done. Then let's say you're going through some type of stage of training. You could continue to monitor that. Then you get your follow-up labs. You see, okay, how am I currently feeling relative to what this marker says? It's like your quantitative and qualitative data. But in your lifestyle, there's still quantitative metrics that we can look at, like how many times are you going a day? How well formed is my stool, like Bristol stool chart? Those can be little information points in between the lab testing to then make effective coaching decisions. So with digestion, let's say the scale hasn't changed and we check in and it's like, nope, I'm going twice a day. Things are pretty good. Bowel movements are all right. I'm a little bloated after like my 4th meal, but I might say, okay, let's go for a walk after that meal, see how it goes. And let's, hold steady in these areas. How are you feeling around training? Is there an opportunity that maybe we could sneak some food in there? Maybe they're fine there. So we try that out, come back. The walk is really helping with the distension or bloating. Now, okay, let's see if we push calories a little bit further. So having those little checkpoints, it gives you the green light to be able to make a decision based on the person. So
how do you quantify stress?
So stress could be a number of things. So I think you're wearing like an Oura ring, right? Okay. So for some people, it could be anything from their using things like HRV, blood pressure. They don't have those markers. You can kind of use resting heart rate as a proxy. Stress is going to be a little more qualitative in like perceived stress, but that does play out in if someone feels like they're stressed, usually there is a level of stress, especially if you're working with someone who's kind of taking their training seriously. I might also look at that in conjunction with recoverability. Like if I haven't drastically changed a nutrition or training stimulus, but someone's lifestyle has changed and they're telling me their recovery is not that good, it's probably sleep or stress that's playing into that.
Yeah.
So let's say someone's eating 3,000 calories and they're training 5 days a week, and I have not changed that, but now I'm seeing other changes in biofeedback. Well, it's usually going to be related to their sleep or their lifestyle, right? So stress may change based on lifestyle. Let's say they, for example, I'm about to do like a West Coast work-related trip in the next couple of weeks. Because of that, it's going to impact my lifestyle, which will play out in terms of biofeedback, which can impact training. I could try to keep nutrition completely consistent. I could do the same movements at the gym, but if these other indicators move, there's going to be aspects of that. Now, stress, you can physiologically measure that in different labs, but in between, in just a quick touch base, it's just like, hey, how are you doing? How are you feeling this week? What's your stress life? What's family like or work like? I mean, I'm sure you have spent enough time between work and training where when you've got a crazy week work-wise, and I could ask you like, hey, 1 to 5, how stressed are you? You'd be like, I'm a 7 right now.
Yeah. So with your West Coast trip, knowing that stress is going to go up, will you pull back on the training to help mitigate that stress?
It's kind of this would depend on what the person's goal is.
Yeah.
If it's someone who's just doing this as a lifestyle, then we may adjust. If it's an athlete and they have a deadline, you're going to do the best you can to stay on track. That's where the nuance is like, what is the goal? That's going to usually steer it. For me right now, it kind of depends. Do I have to have a really good energy level for a podcast or conversation, or am I speaking at a conference or something? Versus if I'm not doing that, okay, maybe I can still push the training and I'm going to be able to, do I have more time to sleep? But that would really be a combination of jet lag, circadian rhythm conversation. Sometimes it's not always just deliberate, like acute stress, but I would use that with let's say, they've got something going on with their kids or something going on personally or marriage wise. That just opens a door for conversation about life. I don't always need a serum cortisol marker or a 4-point salivary cortisol to understand, like, if I see your sleep is impacted and you're not getting to sleep on time, or you tell me, hey, this is what's going on in my life, or you have, a relative pass away or someone loses their job, like, they're going to be stressed. So it's just a matter of making a deliberate effort to connect with the people that you're working with to understand what's going on in their life, because it will impact the execution of the program. And even the people who do put the blinders on and they're great and they're laser focused, it still does impact them in their internal health. Even if they're nose down, like they're going to grind it out. Even those individuals, there are still internal health changes that will happen, even if they're tuning out the noise and they're still committing to their training. I just like to have little checkpoints. As far as what you use per person, can the accuracy of HRV vary? Yes. Can someone's accuracy of heart rate vary? Yes. Do we know that blood pressure is going to change with stress or caffeine and things like that? Yes. But I think if you have a little bit of a proxy for what's normal for the individual, you can kind of see where they're going off the rails, or like, it's kind of just, I view this as if we were bowling, my goal is to roll the ball towards the pins. I don't want to roll a gutter ball. I don't always have labs every single day. Most people can't afford to go get labs like every month. So I need something in between to assess someone's physiology and quality of life. In a perfect world, like, would I get every single, all these biometrics and have like a athletic lab that I could run people through to make every single decision? But that's not how the world works. And most people can't afford that, nor do they want to do that. And it's kind of annoying. So we need these checkpoints in between that are kind of a pulse on the person's life and the situation. And then we have those have like quantitative markers that have some substance to them, that then we make like larger, grander scale decisions around based on that. So like, you got your labs back, you're going to go see Serrano. That may impact your approach for what's coming up in the next few months. But in that time, you're still going to need to navigate life. Yeah. So that's where I kind of plug in those little things.
So just sticking with stress there, sorry, 1 minute. A question that comes up a lot, I'm sure for a lot of coaches, will be, client is, hey, next couple of weeks going to be super stressful, completely unavoidable. Maybe it's a new kid, maybe they're starting a new job, whatever it's going to be. do you have any strategies that you employ to help people deal with unavoidable kind of shorter term stressful periods? So like, high dose creatine, for example, has kind of been shown to help alleviate some of the symptoms from like sleep deprivation. And so do you have anything that you employ in those unavoidable stressful periods to help your clients navigate them without the downsides that come with them?
I think it depends on a couple of things, like the novelty of the stressor, how unpredictable or predictable is this? Like if your wife's pregnant and roughly, like, okay, around month 8 or 9, like it's going to be go time eventually. So if I had a client, I just would plan around that, right? Like I'm not going to say, hey, you have a newborn at home. This is a great time for your contest prep because you're not sleeping, right? It's going to impact your hunger. It's going to impact your training. Why don't we make that more of like a maintenance phase? So if it's a predictable stressor that I can plan for, or you have something with work, or you have a busy season, or that something's going to happen, why not work around? Like, why not work with that? I think if it's unpredictable, you have to just adapt and do the best that you can.
Sure.
As far as supplements, I know, aside from things like caffeine for acute sleep deprivation, there's good evidence to support something like rhodiola for fatigue, and using it, whether it's in the morning or pre-training, could be helpful. So adaptogens can be used there. But I do like, for most things, you can plan for it if you have good communication. The problem is most people don't have good communication, or clients don't think that their coach needs to know that, so they don't mention it. So it's creating like this open door policy of, hey, if you have something going on in your life, I'd like to know about it. I don't need your life story every single time, and I don't need to know that like your landscaper comes on Thursdays at 10 a.m., but I do need to know if something's going on, like that's major life related and going to impact training and nutrition, or you feel as though it's impacting you or something's going on. So if it's planned travel, if it's a newborn, we're probably not going to, I wouldn't use that as my time to push training crazy hard. I wouldn't use it as a time to be in a huge calorie deficit if it's related to nutrition. And it may impact the progress you make in like a health phase if you're not sleeping all the time, but that will pass. Versus, let's say, so I have some older relatives, some of them are dealing with health issues. It's a little unexpected and you don't always know what's going to go, like how things are going to play out. It's not always in your control. In that situation, you may need to adapt on like a week to week or month to month basis and just have really good communication with your coach. So if it's something like, for example, you're working with a guy and they have a kid at home, well, let's do what we can to help with the sleep quality during the hours they're actually getting. Cool, dark room, blackout curtains, like maybe an eye mask if they need one. Do they need earplugs or like white noise machine? Now, you may not be able to do that if you're helping at home with a newborn, right? So maybe it's just keeping the room cool and dark, and you got blackout curtains or an eye mask. Maybe you're using some things for sleep supplementation, maybe magnesium, glycine, theanine, things like that. Then I'll move to, okay, in the morning, can I do something to help from a cognitive perspective? Could be caffeine, rhodiola, maybe some nootropics or something like that to support training. Certainly, can you use that? Yes. But it's also, you're kind of dealing with an inevitable obstacle, right? It's not going to go away right the second. So I think it's, can I plan for it? If so, let's make sure it's a lower stress stimulus, and we know that we can still maintain a good amount of muscle even without like insane training volume. So let's figure out what is the effective dose that can help me like not regress during that time. So I'm in a really good place when life does kind of calm down to be able to do that. I think the trickiest ones are either unexpected related to work, or people who have family things pop up where it's like, now we're working with adults and they become the primary caretakers for like their mom or dad or their uncle or their grandparents, and those types of things can really throw a wrench in it. I've seen that play out, and that's part of life. So I think as a coach, it's being understanding and receptive and adaptable. And that's something that I feel like in terms of, it can't be replaced. Like the perfect program isn't going to override that.
Yeah. I'll put out how I do exactly what you just said. So I knew just for this year, because there's seasonality in this stuff, that, from mid-January till, end of February, it's kind of like blast mode. So I will leave and go out of town for the 2 weeks beforehand, just to clean up all the low hanging shit that I don't want to come during that other time. And my strength phase ends in December, so now it's in a different kind of training phase. And then as I progress through that, I'll have 4 main training days per week. 2 are like bodybuilding crap. The other 2 are heavy. Those 2 main days per week, volume gets cut in half. Eventually, one of the days will just not be there. My steps will go up from a 5,000 average a day to 10,000, and not like outside on, like it's outside, right? So I purposely make those outside. This is just kind of how I mitigate all this crap. And then the extra crap that I would normally eat, I don't eat, so like pizza on Friday or something. I avoid all that. I'll be in bed at 9, doesn't mean I'm going to fall asleep, at 9, so all these are, it still is going to redline at a certain point, because after so many weeks, then the modafinil will come in, the caffeine will come in. I'll also cut the caffeine while I'm away for 2 weeks, which sucks, by the way, right? I don't have a huge caffeine intake. I try to cap it at 500 milligrams. I don't know if that's big or not big, but that's where I try to cap it, and throughout the whole day. And so I pull it, and that sucks, like that sucks. I'm the person that gets like those screaming headaches after like 3 days of doing that. So then I'm desensitized. So then when I start to put it back in, it kind of helps. And my supplementation will go up. And it's based upon, this is me, right? And Eric working this through. The NAC goes up, the C goes up, the D goes up, the coenzyme Q, whatever.
Coenzyme Q10.
Q10 goes up.
Like ubiquinol.
Wobazine, which is, I basically take 3 handfuls a day of that. I don't even know what's in all that shit. It's just, he told me to take it a long time ago. And
that's now, the joint supplement, right?
Yeah.
Like hyaluronic acid.
Yes. Now my main, on the main heavy days on the weekend, sometimes it may just be that one movement and then some stability work. That's it. So trying to basically knowing it's going to.
This is like January, February, busy work season.
Yes, okay. Work season, right? So work hours go up, all this go up, events come up. There's things that are going on throughout all that. And just trying to maintain the immunity as high as we possibly can, through supplements and all the other stuff. And run that through. And typically it works real well. It would have worked better this time had I stayed more compliant with the supplements and some of the other things that I was doing. But that can't last forever either. So it's planned, but there's also, this is when.
Yeah, or you try to make it last forever, and eventually your body will take a break, or you get sick, or something happens where there's a downside. So,
and you want to avoid that,
correct?
Right?
Because then it takes more time to get back on track, or you're missing time that could have been spent in another phase.
Yes, so, and when that actually happens, because it has happened to me, then there's no need in actually blasting, because when I look at how long it takes to recover back to where it was, all that work could have just been laid out over 4 months instead of trying to jam it all into 6 weeks.
Yeah.
So avoiding that's the key.
It's a seasonality conversation, but also self-awareness is like you've gotten to a place where you acknowledge that. I think when someone's earlier in their lifting career and also just life in general, and I think I was kind of like thrust into this earlier on, combination of family, work, jobs, like just life happens. But I think self-awareness is a missing piece. And so sometimes your coach has to help create the self-awareness for you if you don't have it. Or you have people like Eric in your life who can be like, hey, dude, this is what's going on. Let's have a conversation about this. But it's seasonality, but also understanding that the seasonality has to come from a place of self-awareness, of knowing your work life, your personal life, how things typically go.
I would not have known these things had it not been working with Eric for so long, and Merrick as well. And, Tom and some other people that can kind of help give suggestions and ideas. Another thing I do is I take all the social media apps off my phone. I put it on a different phone during this time period. So that way, when I do have the time to just chill, I'm just laying there bored, which is what I'd rather have, the bored state. So my mind can just shut down and relax. And those coaches per se were invaluable, right? Because a lot of these things that I just all mentioned, had you said to me like 10 years ago, I'd tell you to fuck off. Like, no way am I going to do that. I just go until my body just shuts, and then whatever, I mean, sometimes you need that phase to appreciate the other sides of it, though. Well, getting older kind of sucks with that too, because I can't push like I used to. Well, I can, but I have to mitigate it.
You just pay more for it now.
Yeah. No, it's when I was younger, I could just say fuck it and just do it. and kind of maybe I did, maybe I didn't get away with it. Who knows, right? But you get older, you got to be more strategic about it. And I think, planning for it, as you said, is huge. And there's other times, where life happens. For me, those are kind of easier to navigate.
Yeah, a little bit. I think it's when you work with older and younger clients, you see it. I think if you've competed before, you've seen it. I kind of learned it through a combination of like my own personal health history and then seeing it play out with clients. And I was like, okay, maybe there's something to this. It wasn't something that I used to really fully embrace, when I started training or competing or had different people doing, preps or anything like that. And you have to learn to later understand and appreciate it, usually either because something's happened to you or a client and it wasn't super favorable. And so you have that perspective, because there are going to be people who earlier on, they view that wisdom as kind of blasphemous. Like you can't do that. And so it's important to have that realization, I think, and be able to kind of step back and see, or that you have really, it's prioritization too. Like you're prioritizing work and then you have a phase where you can focus on training and do these other things. So I think that's great.
Go ahead.
I had this written down anyway, but since Dave has already brought it up, I did want to talk to you about stimulants. From a gut health neurology point of view. What's your general standpoint and kind of protocol with clients maybe who either are dependent on or have a very high intake of them, but want to maybe bring it down or look at avenues where they want to be less dependent on them?
This is like your Allie question, because Allie crushes some stimulants. So typically what I see when people abuse the stimulants or caffeine, tend to see it in a gut health perspective with increased motility for the most part. Also will eventually play into, depending on when they're drinking that caffeine, begins to impact sleep. And then there are certain things that can impact the half-life and metabolism of caffeine. For example, if you also drink and you consume alcohol, which some athletes don't, but if you are consuming alcohol, that can extend the half-life of caffeine and impact sleep. So first and foremost is like total amount per day. There's not always like one amount for everyone. The cutoff is important, because realizing that clearing that caffeine is different than, okay, you drank the Monster at 3, but that doesn't mean it's out of your system at 3. So the biggest issue I see in athlete populations, or just people who view themselves as athletes or training intensely, is they'll go have pre-workout and train after work. It's like 5, 6, 7 p.m. Then they're trying to go to sleep. Caffeine also has a little bit of a thermic effect as well. So then bringing down your core body temperature post-training after having something like a pre-workout or caffeine later in the day is really a problem. So I think front loading the intake is important first and foremost, to respecting some type of caffeine cutoff relative to when you go to sleep. Now, a lot of people go to sleep at different times, different work demands, different training demands, that will impact the timing of it. And, caffeine can be used. And I think having that period where you rotate off is great. If you do get headaches, you can titrate down or just swap. So if you normally drink coffee or an energy drink, can you either switch the size of like the drink that you're drinking? Can you go from, let's say I'm going to use more of a sports example. You're drinking Bang and you switch to Monster. Okay, you just went from 300 to 140, right? Same size beverage. So you might start someone with things that aren't going to rock their habits, routines, and rituals that they have. It's just, okay, similar size drink. We just went to less in caffeine. Maybe you want to try to move them away from energy drinks entirely and go to like coffee. Maybe you swap that and then you make that substitution. Or the person's having cold brew, like nitro cold brew, and has 300 plus milligrams of caffeine. You move them to something that's a little bit less on the density side, and then you kind of taper it down.
Would that take longer then?
It would, but also you can sometimes offset things like headaches. So I might just bring someone So if you get
personally, I'd rather just deal with 2 days of headaches and be done.
It really depends on the person. And also, are we trying to make this more of a sustainable, permanent change?
Yeah.
So if someone's just super high in general, titration can be helpful. If someone's just doing it to resensitize, you could just drop it. You just expect you may get headaches depending on your current tolerance. People also, some people are fast metabolizers of caffeine versus slow metabolizers. That can make a difference in terms of sleep. So first and foremost, when you have a conversation about caffeine, let's talk about sleep quantity and sleep quality. Are you able to fall asleep? What does your sleep latency look like? Basically your time in bed prior to being completely out. So we'll have that conversation. 2, when is your training and is caffeine being used to support the training that you're doing? And if it's later in the day, realizing that caffeine is still in your system and your body core body temperature is going to be higher. So then we probably need to do something to bring that core body temperature back down in addition to the stimulants. I have seen people supplement with like rutacarpine or Vodia rutacarpa to like help with a little bit of that caffeine clearance, but for the most part, you should probably either drop it, or can we adjust the training time at all, or is this fixed just
how would you bring that temperature down?
So you could do something like contrast hydrotherapy. You could just, let's say they don't have like a Chili Pad or Uller or 8 Sleep or Sleep Me, whatever brand you subscribe to. I don't really care, but it's like a cooling mattress pad, bringing your ambient temperature down in your home with the thermostat, opening a window if it's, fall, winter months. Just any of those things. Simple things can go a long way. It doesn't need to be like you're doing crazy biohacking, but if you can, let's like, because some people will kind of like dilly-dally get into the gym. So if that's the problem, let's move the training up. And then if you still are having some caffeine, then okay, is it pre-workout or is it like a cup of coffee? Like what are you doing pre-training? And then are there other stimulants being involved too? Because people will take other things on top of that. If we can, moving it earlier in the day is helpful, because I think there's a newer study on caffeine and circadian rhythm. I mean, sometimes we're looking at it's still, you could have even an earlier caffeine cutoff and still have some sleep detriments in terms of overall sleep quantity and quality. So look at total milligram amount, look at cutoff, but a lot of it is like, why are you drinking the caffeine? Some people, it's just like a mindless habit. And then other people are using it for training, but it's training later in the day. And we need to account for the body temperature aspect related to sleep. I think that's super important. You can cut it out like Dave mentioned and just drop, or you can do a titration. I've also seen, speaking of like peptides, American, things like that, certain nasal sprays like C-Max and Selank can sometimes help people's sensitivity to caffeine. So if you can drop it down and then use a compound like that may support or enhance your response to caffeine, you're getting more mileage out of the milligrams you're taking. So I've seen that work well, as like using some of the more nootropic peptide nasal sprays along with caffeine, and people report, I don't think there's like a study on it yet, but just seeing it play out in real people is like...
Would you ever like substitute in some others, so like things like L-theanine, alpha-GPC, those types of lion's mane or mushroom extract? Would you ever substitute those in during a titration or a cleaning up phase, for one of a better?
I think if someone's jittery with response to caffeine, theanine paired with the caffeine can like kind of level them out a little bit. I'm not sure if you meant like teacrine or teacrine.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So that's a little different than theanine, and that'll be a little bit more of a stimulant. Lion's mane, alpha GPC, tyrosine, there are things that can help with cognition, and tyrosine will help from the dopamine angle. So you could do that. Like if you're bringing caffeine down, you could bring in some things that are known to support cognition, along with maybe a more anti-fatigue style adaptogen like rhodiola. You could probably do that. If the person was really trying to like optimize everything and they're very sensitive to it and they're really trying to bring that caffeine down, but they have something on the line like work or training and they really need to still be performing top notch, I think you could either use both herbal or amino acid based support. So on the herbal side, it could be like your rhodiola. You could be using, we talked about tyrosine, lion's mane. From a fatigue perspective, I guess like in the mushroom family, you could go with cordyceps as well with that lion's mane conversation. But I think for some people, like tapering caffeine, minding the milligrams, doing the cutoff, you start to get better sleep. When you get better sleep, you're not as reliant on this vicious cycle of caffeine. Then on top of that, you could add some different compounds or things like choline. I
suppose the reason I asked that is because like, the person who takes the pre-workout obviously wants it for the energy, perceived energy, right? But the person who takes it at work probably wants to focus better. So I suppose then the question becomes, is caffeine even the best choice for that person at that point? Or are they better off saving that ACE card for their workouts and so on and so forth?
Probably depends on the goal and depends on the person, but caffeine still will help with cognitive enhancement. I think people can overshoot it and get really jittery. So if you're overshooting the caffeine, that's not going to help. But if you need to like sit still and get work done, there are, those non-stimulant nootropics that can help. And that's where I also think I'm really interested to see things continue to play out with the peptide family as well, because if that can help people and it's not caffeine and it's not Adderall and it's not overly stimulating, well, that could be really good too. We also have different herbals that may help with memory. So whether that's Bacopa, or then on the non-herbal side, that'd maybe be something like acetyl L-carnitine taken consistently might help with neurodegeneration, cognition, and things like that. So you could, but there's definitely an individual variance in response to that. Like I've seen people take the same, Bacopa, acetyl-carnitine, Cognizin for choline, or CDP choline, alpha GPC, and they're not necessarily getting the same response as that other person from a again, that dopamine aspect. I think putting tyrosine in there if you were titrating could be good, and then like kind of rotate.
Sure.
Cool. Is diet soda the devil?
Aspartame.
So I don't think it's the devil. I'm picturing if we cut this up, it's like the scene from Waterboy where his mom's like, "Foosball is the devil," Ricky, or not Ricky, Bobby Boucher. I was mixing up Ricky Bobby and Bobby Boucher for a minute. Talladega Nights and Waterboy, both good, but different ones. So she's like, "It's the devil. Vicky's the devil." So artificial sweeteners and soda, diet soda. If someone's super overweight and it's a substitute that helps them to manage their calories, I think again, what's worse for that person? Consuming a very calorically dense, like nutrient void soda that's got 200 calories in it when they're already overshooting by a ton, and getting their body fat down and improving their metabolic health. Yes, would it be great if they drank water? Let's move them towards water, maybe some electrolytes and water, stuff like that. That's fantastic. But I think we got to start somewhere. If you eventually want to hedge your bets a little bit and use some natural sweeteners, and maybe you drink like Zevia or something with, stevia or monk fruit, that's totally great if you want to do that. I think sometimes we end up again in these like black or white, yes or no questions versus what is the total dose and relative consumption? Do you drink it once a week when you go out with your family, or you drink 6 Diet Cokes a day? And it's also your source of caffeine. You're getting, you're also having artificial sweeteners, all these other things. I think if given your option, probably a good idea to hedge your bets. Probably wouldn't push it as like, should not be your main beverage. You need to drink water. If you are overweight and it helps you reduce your calories and follow, use it as a tool for satiety, because the carbonation can help. Some people will drink that instead of water to help, with their appetite. That's fine too. But eventually, can we move to like, the degree of substitution should continue to improve over time, and then look at total consumption across the week and across the day. Is it probably like the best thing for your gut health? There's probably better options out there, but in terms of the overall glycemic response and looking at the overall calories and everything, what most research seems to suggest is like moving to the 0 calorie option is going to improve someone's metabolic health and someone who's metabolically unhealthy and insulin resistant, because we've just cut out a bunch of like high fructose corn syrup or sugar or whatever, move to the diet option. Then from that diet option is this person embarking on a healthier lifestyle where they're drinking more water. Maybe they have other beverages that they're including and things like that. I think we can move that direction. Then from there, okay, do we have a conversation about maybe they substitute something that's not super sweetened? They can do that. So it depends on the person. And then there's people who are in prep where it's like, that's their thing that's helping them kind of get through that time, but also don't abuse it if you're having multiple a day. So my personal philosophy is like, you can find research to argue 6 ways to the weekend. So what is the reasonable kind of middle ground thinking critically is like, it should not be your main beverage, period. Number 1. 2, if you're overweight and it helps you manage your appetite and get your calories down to get more metabolically healthy and lose fat, you can probably keep it in for a period of time to get you moving in that right direction. If you're someone who drinks them occasionally and it is not something you have all the time, but maybe a few times a month, probably not a big deal. But then when it's like that repeated, because I will see people drink energy drinks, Diet Coke, they've got probably something in their coffee too. They're having their protein and supplements is also artificially sweetened. Then at that point, it's like, it's in every single thing that you're drinking. We don't know. We don't have a study on that. And also just from the perspective of you're really pushing far in that direction that you're hoping that it's totally fine. So I don't think we know that yet. My preference, if it was me or with a client, I would say, hey, let's clean it up a little bit. But if you have a couple, like, I'm not going to be super upset about it. And there's an individual difference between people. So some people can have an artificially sweetened drink, they're fine. Other people are bloated afterwards, or it impacts their bowel movement, they're distended, they're retaining water. So if you have that individual response, your body is telling you like, hey, I'm not a huge fan of this thing, versus someone can drink it and have no perceived negative side effects. I think that's a different story. So if you're having perceived negative effects, probably trim it. If you're someone who seems to tolerate them pretty well, you might be able to get away with more. But again, should probably not be the only thing that you're drinking.
Since we're dealing with if we're talking about, the average listener here, probably on a reasonably high protein diet, probably on, if they're in a gaining phase, probably more calories than the average person. So a common complaint that will usually come up is some degree of like acid reflux, which obviously we can link back to things like the diet sodas and stuff like that. But in your experience, what are the best kind of strategies for people who suddenly develop issues like that? What are, say, the common causes and good strategies for helping mitigating it, rather than going out and buying antacids and kind of putting a Band-Aid over it?
Yeah. So instead of antacids, I would consider first starting by just like keeping a basic food journal and what's triggering your symptoms. And if possible, kind of rotate those foods out for a period of time. Sometimes for people, it's nightshades or certain things like tomatoes or peppers, whatever. Maybe rotate it a little bit. We may reintroduce or add that food back in. From a supplement perspective, we may just want to look at what's going on with their digestive enzymes and stomach acid. So you could do, I think Serrano will have people do like a baking soda test sometimes, but you can also do like a betaine HCl challenge to see how you respond to the titration of taking that support.
Can you explain the baking soda test just for anyone who doesn't know what that is?
So I think it's after 3 minutes. It's either 3 minutes or 5 minutes. I'd have to like check my notes on it. But basically, you take a very small amount of baking soda, and I can always give you this to you guys if you want to put it in the show notes. But you're basically taking a very small amount, usually with a little bit of water, and you're looking at the time that it takes for you to burp. Okay. And then if you respond one way or the other, you're using it as an assessment for stomach acid. Okay. What I've leaned on over the years is like looking at symptoms of low stomach acid first, like early fullness at a meal or having a hard time in terms of your digestion and assimilation of nutrients. And then you can also see some things in your blood chemistry that may indicate, it's kind of a proxy for it, right? It's not perfect. But if I see early fullness at a meal, they're stressed out, consuming a lot of caffeine, all of those things lower stomach acid. So that in itself is going to provide support that, hey, this person may benefit from like a digestive enzyme with HCl, and you can just start low, right? I think some people overdo it. They're like, oh, I need this enzyme. So then they're taking, these massive servings. So you could assess like your individual digestive biofeedback and then move from there. I want to say it's like a teaspoon, roughly like a teaspoon of baking soda. And
familiar, yeah.
I think it's 3 or 5 minutes. I'm having a huge like brain fart on this, so I apologize. But you can either do that, or I do know practitioners who will do more of or coaches who will do more of the betaine HCl challenge, which is basically you get capsules with no other ingredients in it. You start very low and you're consuming it at your animal protein containing meals to then titrate that up, versus overshooting it or not having the right amount for the person. But most of the time, people are running into those issues because of lifestyle, food choices, could be caffeine. And I find that most people, what they miss is the opportunity to just simply keep a basic food log. So before you do anything, do that. That would be my biggest advice.
With protein over the last handful of years, you can buy foods that have more protein in it. So like oatmeal with higher protein, and Snickers bars you can get with higher protein. So proteins become like a supplement being put in different food products. What is the availability of when it's being dumped into that? And obviously it's not going to be as good as the protein sources individualized, but I'll see a lot of people that's now becoming the majority of their protein intake.
Yeah. So first, we need to make sure it's a complete spectrum of amino acids. So what kind of protein's being added?
Yeah.
If it's only like pea by itself or rice by itself in terms of vegan or vegetarian based plant proteins. You really need the combination. You need pea and rice together to create a complementary array of amino acids. So that's an issue. Two, a lot of times these are just proteins from like grain containing products that are not, it's not really like an animal based source of protein, right? Or I even saw it the other day. It was like Greek yogurt, but they're adding, so what they're adding to it is either like a whey protein concentrate or a milk protein isolate, or they're just adding things. It's not that different than if you just took a little bit of your protein powder and you just put it in your Greek yogurt and you just mix it up, right? So partially too, don't overpay as a consumer for something that you can easily make at home. But a lot of the added protein stuff, it's either an incomplete protein, it's probably less beneficial than just eating a piece of meat, like a single ingredient whole food, or it's something that you do need to be careful because it can mess with people's digestion. And it's not the same as just because you tolerate like whey protein isolate doesn't mean you're going to go to the store and something has like calcium caseinate and all these other different things that are kind of other forms of protein that are being backfilled into foods. But usually I notice in those snack foods, like Snickers is not a high protein food. If you're having granola, like I'll see it's like 10 grams of protein. That's not really that good. So when you're looking at their granola, just like understand you're eating mainly a carbohydrate and fat containing food. Most of the calories are coming from carbs and fats. It's not protein. When you're reading the protein, what you're going to see is it's either coming from oats and little like the nuts that are in that. It's not actual animal protein or a animal byproduct like milk or eggs, for example. Or they'll add things that they're using in the mixture, which maybe it's a protein powder when they're blending all of it together. But still at that point, you'd probably be better off buying the regular version and then adding your own protein, unless it's just like you're traveling and it's a convenience thing. But most of the time when they end up doing that, they're adding a bunch of other stuff that I've seen kind of skew digestion a little bit too. So maybe stick with the normal, you mentioned oatmeal, for example, right? Why are you going to pay probably 2 to 3 times as much versus if you're someone listening to this podcast, you probably have a tub of protein somewhere in your house, right? I would think like in your pantry,
a few of them.
A few, or you've got something in the fridge, right? You've either got animal protein on deck or you've got some eggs, or even if you are plant-based and you happen to listen to this, you probably got some protein powder. So what would be the difference between you just putting a little side of protein together to go with that meal, or mixing it in, or doing your own thing? Because you're basically paying more, and sometimes it's a lesser quality because it's just being mass produced. Their specialty, if you're walking through the middle of the grocery store, their specialty is probably not like protein supplements. They make snack foods, right? They're not here for anabolism. So just understanding, being able to do that, navigate it, you could probably pay less, put it towards a good quality protein supplement, mix it in with the food you're having, or just have it with the snack or meal that you're having. And all of a sudden you've basically supercharged that versus something that's marketed as high protein that has like 8 to 12 grams of protein or 17 grams of protein. For most of the people who are larger individuals, that's not going to cut it anyways. And in many cases, it's lower in leucine and other essential amino acids. So we're not even getting that same benefit from a muscle or overall health perspective versus if you were to just have some single ingredient animal foods.
So since we're talking protein, then we've, over the decades or years or whatever, we've gone from you can't absorb more than 30 grams at one sitting to you can absorb more than 30 grams at one sitting, but 30 grams gets you maximum protein synthesis. So anything you eat after that is not doing anything for us. And now, obviously, I think there was 1 or 2 studies that came out in the last year that seem to indicate that upper ceiling of how much protein synthesis we can get from a single protein feeding is considerably higher potentially than what we thought. So what's just your take on protein intake overall, but also how you spread it?
So there was a new study within the last year or two that basically supported that you can get away with a higher threshold. But part of this too is a digestion conversation of what can you actually get down. I personally lean on, there's no point in just going to your minimums for protein, in my opinion. Like there's just so many benefits, not only from a appetite management perspective, recovery perspective. Now I have seen people overshoot it to where they're not eating enough carbohydrates or fats because they're just so protein dominant. It's extreme. But I would say set it high enough where you're able to manage your appetite, you're recovering well. And And that may be above like a gram per pound of body weight. If you're, there are people enhanced that are closer to 2, but I think where some of the papers landed was like closer to what would have amounted to be like 1.5 grams per pound. So I think you start at, first of all, to like, what's your body composition? Are you a lean individual, or are you someone who's super overweight and obese? In that case, you may be setting based on your goal body weight. In terms of thresholds, I think people major in the minors too much. Like a lot of the people who are worried about, oh my God, I'm not going to assimilate and absorb this protein. They're not even hitting their daily protein. And then they're worried about like one meal. Oh my God, I'm having 60 to 80 grams of protein. I can only have 40. It's like, well, why don't you just try it and get hit your daily target before then? Like our overall spectrum should be daily and weekly amounts. And then you move to meal by meal decisions. And then at those meals, are you actually able to do so in a way that doesn't negatively impact your physiology or your biofeedback? So if you feel like shit, or you're lethargic, or it impacts your training, okay, maybe you need to back it down a little bit because you were too full and distended and you didn't feel good. So you felt sloshy and suboptimal when you're actually entering the gym. So I kind of look at that daily amount, weekly amount, kind of like energy balance. And then from there, let's look at how you respond. And it's also the type of protein too. Like you could probably get down a certain amount from ground meats, or maybe a protein powder, or maybe whole eggs digest well for you. But then maybe a food like a turkey breast or a chicken breast, you're just like, you can't do it. So trying to find that for the individual person, I think a lot of people who are sweating the amounts of protein in those thresholds just haven't tried. And then also like chew your food. And if you need to, take some digestive support if you have to, and like assess. I think people need to try stuff. Right? Like people don't actually try stuff, and then they generally will insert their opinion on the internet, and like they haven't actually tried it. So I'm a bigger proponent of try it on for size. If it works for you, great. If it doesn't, that's okay too. So it's like, really, when we look at our community and even the online discussion, it should really be like, what has worked with coaching other clients? What has worked in that person's individual training and nutrition history? And then if you have research, because there's people who go too far one way or the other. Like you mentioned the research study when you were even asking the question. So I answered with some research, but I think people go too far that direction too, because if the client or person is literally telling you that they're bloated and super uncomfortable, just because the threshold says you can take 100 doesn't mean you need to have 100. If the person's protein goal for the day, let's say this is a female athlete and it's like 150, she doesn't need to eat 100 in a meal. She could get away with a smaller amount. So let's look at the person's individual training nutrition history. Let's look at what the evidence says. And then what is your experience as a coach? How have you seen this play out over time? Has this gone well? Has this worked before? Is there someone similar to this person that actually played out for? So try it on for size. And guess what? Like worst case scenario is like you adapt, you audible, and you do something different. But a lot of the people who are quoting those studies, it's like, I don't know that they've tried both, or they're so biased one way or the other. I know people who have incredibly impressive muscular development and are strong individuals, and they have like 3 big meals a day. And then there's people who split it up and they've done the smaller meal thing. But what's probably similar is from a total daily protein intake perspective, they're getting that in, they're training consistently. And then where your fine tuning is based on your own physiology and your response to things. I think there is a little bit of bio-individuality, but we can look at the papers and the research and the journals and studies as like, that's like your guidelines. And then within that, how do we refine based on someone's individual anecdotal experience of what they feel best on? And I think you go from there.
I mean, the one study that came out was, I think it was that protein synthesis activation, or whatever you want to call it, kept increasing up to something like 120 grams in one sitting. And as you can imagine, then the whole intermittent fasting crowd were like, we told you, get it all in one day. Like that's but it's like, again, you take that say bikini competitor who weighs 130 pounds or whatever, and you're like, okay, here's a pound of chicken.
Yeah, just because you can doesn't mean you should.
Like, how's that going to sit with you?
Yeah, just because you can doesn't mean you should, and just because it can be executed doesn't mean it's optimal. So I think even in this conversation around protein, for a 120-pound bikini competitor, she should not be getting. It's unnecessary and probably not the best for her appetite to get 100 grams in one sitting out of her whatever X intake she's consuming. So I look at appetite management, and this is where I can kind of tie it back to some of the principles in the book. If you're not maximizing adherence, if you're not managing your appetite, and you're not maximizing absorption, well, that's our checklist. So let's take the study and run it through that. Study says I can have up to 100 or 100 to 120 grams of protein, I think is what you just referenced. I'm just going to hypothetically go off that amount. Well, let's say I feel bloated and it's not that great, but then I'm super hungry later in the day because I like overshot my protein earlier. Well, now that's not working from an actual adherence and appetite management perspective. So that doesn't actually, like, run it through a critical thinking filter. It doesn't actually work for you. So let's try something else. Let's split it up. Okay. Normally you eat 4 times a day. This is your daily protein goal. What if we try evenly dividing it? Or we know that you always get hungry at X time, or you need a bigger meal post training. Cool. Let's increase the protein. Maybe that person has 60 grams post training, and then the other meals, maybe there's a smaller meal, or they have some work constraints where they can't eat as much food, or they're in a hurry, or they've got to go grab their kids. Work around that and then kind of backtrack. But I think far too often it's like the study will come out and it's like they say jump and people say how high, or like, and even with the intermittent fasting thing you just mentioned, why does the reaction need to be, I told you so, I was right, my internet opinion's better than yours?
But I think in that scenario, the zealots over here and the science zealots over here, they almost suffer from the same issue, which is, it's like they have the ability then to wash their hands of the introspection and the self-experimentation. So like, oh, I tried veganism, I didn't lose weight, the diet wasn't right for me, it's the diet's fault. Whereas like if I'm the science zealot over here, it's like, well, science says this should work and I did it. So I did my bit. But they didn't do the bit that you're talking about, which is the introspection and the self-experimentation and the self-feedback, which is the bit that everyone needs to do to get better.
Especially if you're working with other people, try stuff on yourself first, or at least a degree of it. Like, and it may not be like if I'm not overweight or obese, maybe I'm not going to follow like a very particular thing that person may do, but experiment with the protein intake or different carbs. Or if you want to try a supplement, like maybe don't have your client, like don't fly blind, or go get another professional opinion on it. Like if you haven't tried something, you'd probably ask Serrano, or maybe, maybe you guys would have a conversation together. I think that peer-to-peer conversation is important, and also understanding that sometimes you need to kind of run through it first and then understand the difference in the person that's in front of you. Like, you're not a 125 pound bikini competitor. Hate to break it to you. So in your case, like
that's my weak point.
That's your weak point. So if that's the case, like, let's just adjust over time. But I think in this internet world of I told you so's and trying to be right, it's like, this is all like an iterative process of experimentation to figure out what works. And sometimes it's better for certain people than others. And when you can appreciate that and like find a little bit of excitement and joy, and like you tinker with something and it works out, and then you're like, okay, there's something to this, and then you do it again, and then you do it again, that's cool, and you create a little bit of proof behind what you're doing. But that's why it's so much more of a blended conversation. And I'm grateful that before Instagram became what it is, like I had to actually work with people in person in a gym, right? Or like see someone show up. So if I'm talking about biofeedback online, it's like, when a client shows up or walks through the door for training, or one of your athletes walks through the door and you're like, man, you look like shit today. What happened? Right? Versus online, like you don't get that level of personal connection. So you need to ask better questions. And I think whether we're talking about protein research or intermittent fasting or whatever, if that time restricted feeding works for you and you can stick with it and you're getting progress, more power to you. Cool. You found what works for you, but that doesn't necessarily mean that everyone and their mom on the internet needs to do exactly what you're doing. There's probably general principles from it that are making them successful. So maybe with their time restricted feeding, they're doing something in terms of their protein, carbs, and fats. Maybe they're doing something with their supplementation. Maybe their training is timed in such a way that it fits within the feeding window of their time restricted eating, to where they're still getting the benefits of recovery from the nutrition around their workouts and peri-workout nutrition. So we could take some of the principles and even apply some of those to someone who's not time restricted eating. Or let's say the time restricted eating person's like, I get great sleep on time restricted eating when my last meal of the day is at 5 or 6 p.m. Well, we could take that and apply it to someone who's not following as maybe instead of 16-8 or something like that. They're doing like 12-12, but we could still achieve better sleep by simply not having a huge meal right before bed and having a little better blood sugar control. Cool. I just took clues from this one approach and I can apply it to someone else and still find success without being dogmatic of, oh, time restricted eating or bust. Oh, intermittent fasting or bust. Got to be plant-based, got to be vegan, got to do keto, versus understanding the principles of maybe why that actually worked. And then allowing that to be your framework for thinking about the situations. I think that's a lot better.
Did you have any other questions or topics?
No, that was pretty much it. I was going to say, with a lot of those, when people are...
well, let's take a bathroom break real quick.
We'll do a bathroom break.
Yeah. Hey guys, real quick, we realized that something ridiculous, like 80% of the people that watch the podcast don't subscribe. So subscribe to the channel and make sure to check out the description for more details on the guest, links to their pages, and give us a few days, but the show notes will be there. Or not the show notes, the timestamps. Hey, we're just rolling with this thing right now.
Maybe you've hit your first plateau and you're thinking of hopping on gear, but you realize you're already too small because you're too scared to put more weight on the bar. What do? You can support the podcast and get access to the elitefts Table Talk Discord, which has some of the most valuable information you'll ever get. Access to hundreds of ebooks, assuming you can read. Go ahead and cancel your OnlyFans membership to your favorite bear. Because on this Discord, we have a lot of bears. There's also a great form check section, where no matter what kind of lift you're doing, post a video, tons of people give you great feedback. Or maybe you're doing your own programming like down here. Well, there's a great section on the elitefts Discord where you can upload your programming, people can look at it, give you feedback, and telling you that maxing out 5 days a week makes about as much sense as not wiping after a massive Taco Bell dump. You gotta wipe. There's a button you can click, there's monthly prizes, you can win things like apparel with shirts, bands, all kinds of bands, endless amounts of bands.
Yeah, I think the important thing when we're talking to people with who have experiences like, oh, I went on the keto diet or the Atkins diet or the paleo diet or whatever, and all these wonderful things happen to me. It's like, that's fantastic, but it's important. The two important things to remember is A, what were you doing before? Like, was it just Fruit Loops and pizza? In which case, you were at the bottom of the barrel dietary-wise anyway, in which case, anything would have been a step up and improved all your health markers. It's like, no duh.
Fruit Loops is good, though.
Yeah, I know. We all know that too much. And then B, what's the context? Like, some diets in some contexts are absolutely fantastic, and then in other contexts are the worst possible thing you can do. Like, I was coaching a lady who was recovering from brain cancer, and she was on a keto diet for 2 years because that's what helped her remission. Coach, that was under her doctor's advice and everything like that, and it was perfect. Now she's healthy and in complete remission, and she's like 110 pounds at 5'9", and she wants to get her body back. Well, keto is not the best thing for her anymore now that she's got the all clear, So I think it's also important to remember that A, what's that person's background, and B, also something that works for you now is not also going to work for you in 5 years, 10 years, or maybe when your goals change, your nutrition strategy also needs to fluctuate with that also.
Well, to piggyback off that, I wonder if, say if it's a carnivore or something like that, and, the individual has success with that. Is it so much because of that, or is it because in a way it's just an elimination diet?
So it could be a combination of factors. So with carnivore, typically you're removing an entire food group. If you're doing it in a way that manages your appetite and you consume fewer calories, you can achieve weight loss that way, right? But in terms of their response, let's say this was someone who's overweight and obese, they probably, through calorie restriction and reduction of carbohydrates and eliminating certain food groups, they may have improved their insulin sensitivity, but they're also eating adequate protein and they probably drop their calories, is why they're successful. Now, could there be other benefits? Some people report having improvements in their digestion on more of an animal-based diet. Certainly possible, but I definitely agree with your perspective of like, what has the person done before? What's their training history? What's their health history? What particular diet styles have they followed, and what can they actually adhere to? So if someone can adhere to carnivore and they do it, and they're able, what you need to watch for certain micronutrient deficiencies. So most people are not eating like bones on carnivore, for example. They remove dairy and then they're not having any calcium. So there's other micronutrients that we need to kind of backfill. But looking at it overall, I'd say most people, when they're following more of the fad diets, what they did is they eliminated a food group, they reduced calories, they lost weight. Now, the problem with like plant-based eating or veganism is if they eliminate calories, a lot of people eat a lot of like pre-packaged vegan foods that are not like single ingredient whole foods. They're not usually just only eating like fruit and sweet potatoes and, you know, all these single ingredients. It'll be like, they'll go through the middle of the grocery store and it says vegan on it, or it's like these Oreos are vegan and they're eating those. So I think in that situation, if they're not getting adequate protein, they may lose weight, but they're also losing muscle mass. So the difference between those two fad diets in that sense is maybe in one case, getting slightly more dietary protein in is preserving more muscle. But many cases, really what's happening, they eliminated a food group that cut out calories. Because of the calorie restriction, they lost weight. Now, how much muscle they lose will be dependent on protein intake and training. You know, are they training enough to actually preserve or build muscle?
Well, if they're eliminating all those foods, some of those foods could have been causing the inflammation, or they could have been allergic to those foods. Right. So isn't that the premise between an elimination diet in the first place?
So a well-designed elimination diet should be based off of someone's symptoms in their food log. And then you're going to go through, and I would look at common irritants. So for example, nightshades, sometimes nuts and seeds, gluten, dairy, sometimes eggs, certain foods that are eaten frequently and have certain sort of constituents or components to it can be more irritating than others. Based on what that person reports, there's a couple schools of thought to this. You can either go to like a much more restrictive approach that eliminates a lot of things, and you kind of do that for a period of time and add back in. But what if you look at this person's food journal and you understand like, okay, these are 3 likely suspects. And what if we just attack that? And what if the person's stuff resolves? Then you could have much more freedom and diversity in their intake. And then if need be, you can always do something that's a little bit more intense or rigid. But most people may have benefit from like an adherence perspective with a little bit less restriction there. And from a micronutrient perspective, all of these different fad diets have their weaknesses. Yeah. One of the biggest cons is when you cut out animal foods, leads to a lot of vitamin mineral deficiencies. Even when you cut out, you know, certain carbohydrates and fruits and things like that on a carnivore diet, well, unless you're eating like beef liver and other organs, you are potentially, you know, susceptible to micronutrient deficiencies as well. So yeah, carnivore is like an elimination diet, but the reasons people do it, some people do carnivore because they just want to lose weight. Yeah. Other people are doing carnivore because it resolves things like autoimmune related symptoms and digestive issues, but that's largely because they remove common food irritants and they're just eating meat.
Do you find that the opposite can be true then? So you find, for example, people who go on whatever the diet may be that cuts out X, and then they spend 5 years not eating X, and then they develop an intolerance to it. When they go to add it back in, they no longer handle it very well. And sometimes maybe that'll be a justification of that's why I need to stay on this diet. When do you understand what I'm saying? Like, is it possible to have self-imposed intolerances through these practices where you cut out whole food groups for too long?
I would say a combination of, I would want to look and kind of talk to the client. Some people, it's a very psychological thing. They have these food aversions that's very much like a story around the food, or they think it's like, that's going to make me fat or do this or do that. So one is, what is our kind of viewpoint and how are we assessing this food in the first place? Second would be, you know, in addition to that conversation, can people have symptoms when they reintroduce a food? Yes, but there's a number of different reasons why that could happen. So there's not necessarily just one thing. Two, I think that's largely avoidable with intelligent rotation and elimination in the first place. So if you've gotten that far, it's probably because someone did it themselves, didn't work with a professional, and now they need to be very strategic and careful about how they test different things and as they reintroduce. And then what do I have any symptoms in response to eating that food?
Because I've seen it in 1 or 2 cases where people might go paleo, for example, and things like that, and they do it to achieve a set goal over a couple of years, whatever it might be, and then they go to reintroduce things that used to not be a problem, and now they can't have them. I'm just, you know,
it may be the quantity. So I've seen that too, but sometimes when I dig deeper, I find out that the person is like they didn't eat it for a long period of time, and then they really wanted it, and then they went out and ate like a whole pizza or something, and it upset their stomach. So I would look at both serving sizes. For example, in the process of, let's say you're reintroducing dairy, there might be a difference for the individual in certain Greek yogurt versus cheeses versus milk. Some people can get by with like a good quality Greek yogurt or something versus, or like grass-fed butter. They may be able to tolerate butter or yogurt, but they can't do certain cheeses or they can't do milk. So even within different food groups, specificity is important. And also, what is the quantity, and where did you, was this a home cooked meal, or did you go out to a restaurant and just slam a bunch of a certain food? And you're like, oh, well, I went from paleo and I introduced gluten and it didn't go well for me. Well, if the gluten was like, you went to a pastry shop and just went hard in the paint, like it may not end well for you or the toilet.
Were there any topics that you had that we didn't bring up?
I think this was a really pretty diverse conversation. I think we talked about different diet styles, talked about hormones, lab work, health optimization, a little bit on the book, talked a little bit about just kind of internet space and coaching in general. I feel like we covered a lot of good stuff. But.
Yeah, I think so. I think I picked your brain enough there.
Yeah. Do you have any final thoughts?
Final thoughts. So I would say, just in terms of some important things we talked about today, number one, the importance of actually doing some baseline health testing, seeing where you're at with that. Two, we talked about avoiding the kind of testosterone mills or the men's clinics that are kind of like a hair club of sorts, but just with dishing out different prescriptions. In terms of diets, just, not falling victim to the diet dogma, diet culture, being able to critically think and make decisions there. Talked about seasonality, I think was super important in terms of life, mental health, understanding the conversation about your physical health is going to be very tightly connected to your mental and emotional health and well-being. I think that was great. And remember, when discussing different aspects of your health and systems of the body, they don't exist in isolation. They're really all connected with one another. And when you impact one thing, you'll kind of impact other departments as well. It's not, as much as we like to compartmentalize like our thought process and thinking and emotions, it's not really how your body works. So you will have a systemic impact and consequence from things that you're doing. And we saw that play out even in terms of the pharmacology conversation as well. So I think we hit on a lot of great points. And these are things that I teach on pretty frequently in terms of my content and stuff that pops up all the time. So I think it was cool that between the two of you guys, we really ran the gamut of all the different topics.
And what is the best way to reach you, which is the obvious question, but then what is your intake process like? If it's clients or coaches.
Yeah, of course.
So a little more detail about what you do.
For sure. So in terms of what I do, aside from the book, most of my day-to-day, so I'm obviously creating a ton of content online. I have the podcast, Sam Miller Science, is on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. Pretty much every social channel, that's my handle. So you can find me there, and my website, sammillerscience.com. In terms of what it looks like, if you're someone who is maybe a nutrition coach or fitness professional, you're looking to learn more about some of the topics we talked about today in terms of physiology, in terms of nutrition, that is my specialization program, or nutrition metabolism specialization. And you can learn more about that at metabolismschool.com. That's where we're essentially bridging this gap that exists between the people who only coach macros and then like Western medicine's over here. So if you're not watching on video and you're only on kind of audio here, essentially think about this huge gap that exists, and there's this gray area in the middle. We need people who understand how physiology works and how the inner workings of your body are so important for just this conversation around optimal health and how people are going to respond to their training and nutrition. And we need to understand more than just macros. But at the same time, there's a lot of benefit that can happen when we have these deeper conversations. And it doesn't need to be just like, because medical doctors aren't necessarily having it. So, you're not going to necessarily be scripting medications or doing these things, but you have a great ability to help someone with both their health. And if you're someone who focuses on performance, if you're someone who cares about training and athletes, we talked about the receptivity to training programs and training stimulus and stuff. If you don't have this stuff ironed out, people aren't going to get those optimal results. So I love to hear that you got your labs done and you're checking that out. I think that's great. So that's a lot of what I'm doing through that Metabolism School program. And then my free content, I've got like hundreds of episodes that dive into this type of stuff, really geared towards the professional. But if you're someone who's just really passionate about it and you like learning and kind of geeking out on some of these topics, then certainly have boatloads of info, hours and hours that they can dive into if they're interested.
All right, well, I want to thank you for coming out. Other than that, we're done.
I appreciate it, man.
If we're lowering our weight, passive tension is usually coming from a couple of places. Passive tension will be coming from titin, which is a very large protein molecule that runs through the sarcomere. And we also have the slow detachment rates that are happening between actin and myosin. So you have that combination